Polar bear devours 42-year-old fisherman in 6 minutes, January 5th, 2025. The Arctic wind howled across the Chukchi Sea at 43 miles per hour, carrying with it the scent of seal blood and the promise of death. Daniel Michael Kowalski adjusted his polarized fishing goggles against the glare of the January sun, reflecting off the endless expanse of sea ice that stretched beyond Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska. At 42 years old, Daniel had spent the better part of 2 decades pursuing fish through holes carved in ice thick enough to support a semi-truck. But something felt different about this morning. The ice beneath his insulated Baffin boots seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if the frozen surface of the Chukchi Sea itself was aware of what was about to unfold in the next 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Daniel had awakened at 4:30 that morning in his rented cabin on Akavak Street, the same modest 2-bedroom structure that had housed visiting researchers and adventurous tourists for the past 15 years. The cabin belonged to Margaret Maggie Uki, a 71-year-old Inupiaq woman whose weathered hands had sewn more parkas than she could count, and whose dark eyes held the wisdom of 7 decades spent reading the moods of the Arctic. Maggie had been born in a sod house 12 miles inland from where Daniel now stood, back when Utqiagvik was still called Barrow, and when the old ways of hunting and fishing were not tourist attractions, but matters of survival. She had watched the town transform from a remote whaling station into a modern community, complete with internet cafes and a subway restaurant. But she had never lost her ability to sense when the ice was speaking. That morning, as Daniel prepared his gear in the pre-dawn darkness of the polar winter, Maggie had knocked on his door with a steaming cup of coffee and a warning that would echo in his mind during the final moments of his life. "The bears are moving early this year," she had said, her voice carrying the weight of ancestral knowledge passed down through generations of hunters who had learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between returning home with dinner and becoming dinner themselves. "The ice is thick enough for fishing, but it's also thick enough for hunting. You understand what I mean by that, Daniel?" Daniel Michael Kowalski understood, or at least he thought he did. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Polish immigrants who had arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on their backs and an unshakable work ethic, Daniel had inherited his father's stubborn determination and his mother's ability to find beauty in the harshest environments. His father, Stanisław Kowalski, had worked 34 years in the steel mills before a back injury forced him into early retirement, and his mother, Anna Kowalski, née Nowak, had cleaned office buildings downtown until arthritis made it impossible for her to grip a mop handle. They had raised Daniel and his 2 sisters, Margaret and Patricia, in a 3-bedroom house on the south side of Milwaukee, where the sound of Lake Michigan's waves provided a constant soundtrack to their childhood. The irony was not lost on Daniel that he would die beside another body of water, though the Chukchi Sea bore no resemblance to the relatively temperate shores of Lake Michigan. Where Lake Michigan offered summer beaches and sailing opportunities, the Chukchi Sea presented an environment so hostile that only the most specialized predators could call it home. Daniel had first glimpsed the Arctic Ocean during a fishing expedition to Alaska's North Slope 7 years earlier, and something about the raw, uncompromising beauty of the landscape had called to him in a way that the familiar waters of the Great Lakes never could. Daniel's wife of 18 years, Rebecca Lynn Kowalski née Thompson, had initially supported his increasingly frequent trips to Alaska, viewing them as a way to escape the pressures of everyday life, as a necessary outlet for the restless energy that had made Daniel successful as a commercial refrigeration technician, but difficult to live with during Milwaukee's long winters. Rebecca, a nurse practitioner specializing in pediatric care, understood the need for adventure better than most, having spent her own youth competing in marathon running events across the Midwest. At 40 years old, she had given up competitive running, but retained the lean build and determined mindset that had carried her through 26.2-mile races in Chicago, Detroit, and Minneapolis. Their relationship had begun to strain, however, as Daniel's expeditions grew longer and more remote. What had started as week-long fishing trips to Alaska's more accessible regions had evolved into month-long adventures to places where satellite phones represented the only connection to civilization. Rebecca had expressed her concerns during their last conversation before Daniel departed for what would become his final trip. A phone call that took place on December 30th while Daniel was packing his gear in their basement. "I don't understand why you need to go so far from everything," Rebecca had said, folding Daniel's thermal underwear with the precise movements that characterized everything she did. "There are plenty of places to fish in Alaska that don't require you to fly to the northernmost point in the United States. What's wrong with Anchorage? What's wrong with Fairbanks? Why does it have to be Barrow every time?" Daniel had tried to explain the inexplicable pull he felt toward the Arctic, the way the endless expanse of ice and sky made him feel simultaneously insignificant and profoundly connected to something larger than himself. He had tried to describe the quality of light during the brief daylight hours of the polar winter, how the sun seemed to hang just above the horizon like a distant memory of warmth. He had attempted to convey the absolute silence that descended over the ice when the wind stopped blowing, a silence so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance. But how could he explain to someone who had never experienced it the intoxicating combination of terror and exhilaration that came with standing alone on ice that floated above 4,000 feet of Arctic Ocean? How could he make Rebecca understand that the very remoteness and danger that worried her were precisely what made these expeditions necessary for his psychological well-being? Their conversation had ended with Rebecca agreeing to support his trip, but requesting that he promise to check in via satellite phone every 12 hours without exception. Daniel had readily agreed, not knowing that his satellite phone would be in the process of being destroyed by 1,400-pound jaws at the exact moment he was scheduled to make his first check-in call. The flight from Milwaukee to Utqiagvik had required 3 connections: Milwaukee to Seattle, Seattle to Anchorage, Anchorage to Fairbanks, and finally Fairbanks to Utqiagvik on a twin-engine aircraft that seemed to defy the laws of physics as it battled crosswinds that regularly exceeded 30 miles per hour. Daniel's fellow passengers on that final leg of the journey included Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Hendricks, a 38-year-old climate researcher from the University of Colorado, who was beginning her 3rd winter studying the effects of rising temperatures on Arctic sea ice formation. Dr. Hendricks, whose doctorate in atmospheric physics had taken 7 years to complete due to the extensive fieldwork required for her dissertation, had noticed Daniel's fishing equipment during the boarding process in Fairbanks and struck up a conversation that would later prove crucial to understanding the timeline of events leading up to the attack. Sarah had spent the previous 2 winters in Utqiagvik, collecting ice core samples and monitoring weather patterns, and she had developed a healthy respect for the polar bears that considered the region their hunting grounds. "You're planning to fish out on the sea ice?" Sarah had asked, as their plane encountered turbulence somewhere over the Brooks Range. "I hope you're planning to bring company. The bears have been particularly active this winter. We've had 3 separate incidents where bears have approached our research station, and one of them was persistent enough that we had to fire warning shots." Daniel had assured Dr. Hendricks that he was experienced in Arctic fishing and that he carried both bear spray and a .44 Magnum revolver as standard precautions. What he didn't mention, and what would later become a critical factor in the investigation, was that Daniel had left both the bear spray and the revolver in his cabin that morning, choosing instead to travel light with only his fishing equipment, a thermos of coffee, and his emergency radio. The decision to leave his defensive equipment behind had been made impulsively. based on his assessment of the weather conditions and his desire to move quickly across the ice to reach what he believed would be optimal fishing locations. The temperature that morning was minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill values approaching minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Under such conditions, Daniel reasoned, any polar bear in the area would be conserving energy rather than actively hunting, and the thick sea ice would provide ample warning of approaching wildlife through vibrations transmitted through the frozen surface. This reasoning, while logical from a human perspective, failed to account for the fact that polar bears are uniquely adapted to hunt in precisely such conditions, and that a bear weighing more than half a ton can move across ice with surprising stealth when motivated by hunger. The bear that would kill Daniel Kowalski had been tracked by wildlife researchers for the past 3 years, ever since it was fitted with a GPS collar during a population survey conducted by the United States Geological Survey's Polar Bear Research Program. The bear, designated as Bear 47 in the research database, was a mature male estimated to be between 15 and 18 years old, placing him in the prime of his physical capabilities. At 12 feet long from nose to tail and weighing approximately 1,200 pounds, Bear 47 represented one of the largest polar bears ever documented in the Chukchi Sea region. Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, the USGS biologist responsible for monitoring Bear 47's movements, would later testify that the bear's tracking data showed unusual behavior patterns in the weeks leading up to the attack. Unlike typical polar bear hunting patterns, which involve long periods of patient waiting beside breathing holes used by seals, Bear 47 had been moving continuously across large expanses of sea ice, covering distances of 30 to 40 miles per day in what appeared to be systematic search patterns. Bears don't usually expend that much energy unless they're desperately hungry, Doctor. Rodriguez would explain to investigators from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The tracking data suggests that Bear 47 hadn't had a successful hunt in at least 6 weeks, which is approaching the limit of how long a polar bear can survive without food, even with their remarkable ability to conserve energy. The combination of a desperately hungry apex predator and an unsuspecting human alone on the sea, ice created conditions that wildlife experts would later describe as a perfect storm of circumstances that made a deadly encounter virtually inevitable. Daniel's morning routine on January 5th began at 4:30 with the electronic beeping of his watch alarm, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn quiet of Maggie Yuki's rental cabin. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was gusting to 45 miles per hour, creating wind chill values that approached the threshold where exposed human skin can suffer frostbite in less than 10 minutes. Despite the brutal conditions, Daniel felt a familiar surge of anticipation as he prepared his gear. Ice fishing in the Arctic represented the ultimate challenge for an angler who had spent decades pursuing fish in the relatively benign waters of Wisconsin's lakes and rivers. The technical challenges of maintaining equipment in sub-zero temperatures, the physical demands of working in conditions that could kill an unprepared person in minutes, and the sheer remoteness of the fishing locations combined to create an experience that Daniel found profoundly addictive. His equipment for that morning included a Jiffy Model 30 ice auger capable of drilling through ice up to 4 feet thick, a portable fish house designed to provide minimal shelter from the wind, a selection of ice fishing rods and reels specifically designed to function in extreme cold, and an assortment of lures and bait that had proven effective for Arctic char and other cold water species during his previous expeditions. Daniel also carried what he considered essential safety equipment, a GPS unit with extra batteries, a VHF emergency radio, a first aid kit, emergency flares, a sleeping bag rated to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and enough food and water for 3 days. What he didn't carry due to his impulsive decision to travel light, was any means of defending himself against the apex predator that had already detected his scent and was beginning to track his movements across the sea ice. The decision to venture onto the sea ice alone violated virtually every safety protocol recommended by Arctic survival experts, but Daniel had made similar solo expeditions during his previous trips to Utqiagvik without incident. His experience had taught him that the extreme cold and harsh conditions of the Arctic winter served as a natural deterrent to most wildlife, including polar bears, which typically conserved energy during the coldest months rather than actively hunting. This assessment, while generally accurate, failed to account for individual bears facing starvation conditions, and it underestimated the ability of polar bears to detect and track human scent across vast distances of sea ice. At 5:15 that morning, Daniel loaded his equipment onto a lightweight sled designed for Arctic travel and began the journey from Maggie Yuki's cabin to the edge of the sea ice, a distance of approximately 2 miles through the sleeping town of Utqiagvik. The only other person awake at that hour was Thomas Brower Jr., a 45-year-old Alaska native who worked as a maintenance supervisor for the Arctic Research Consortium and who was beginning his own early morning routine of checking heating systems in the consortium's research facilities. Thomas, whose grandfather had been one of the most successful whale hunters in the region's history, had inherited not only his ancestors' skills as a hunter, but also an intuitive understanding of wildlife behavior that had been developed through generations of survival in one of Earth's harshest environments. As Daniel passed beneath the streetlight outside Thomas's house, something about the man's solitary figure and heavy equipment load triggered an ancestral warning system that Thomas couldn't quite articulate but trusted implicitly. "Hey, you heading out on the ice?" Thomas called out, his breath forming a cloud of vapor that was immediately dispersed by the wind. "Might want to wait for daylight, or at least find someone to go with you. We've had bear signs around the pressure ridges." Daniel paused in his journey, appreciating the concern, but confident in his ability to handle the conditions. "I've been fishing these waters for 7 years," he replied, his voice muffled by the balaclava that covered most of his face. "I know what I'm doing, and I'll be staying close to shore where the ice is stable." Thomas nodded, understanding the independence that characterized many of the visitors who came to Utqiagvik, seeking adventure or solitude. At the same time, his grandfather's teachings had emphasized the importance of community safety, and the idea of anyone venturing onto the sea ice alone during polar bear season violated every principle of Arctic survival that had kept his ancestors alive for thousands of years. "If you change your mind, I'll be around," Thomas offered. "I've got my radio on channel 16 if you need anything." Daniel thanked Thomas for his concern and continued his journey toward the sea ice, unaware that this brief conversation would later be analyzed by investigators as the last opportunity to prevent what was about to unfold. The route from Magiuki's cabin to the ice edge took Daniel through the heart of Utqiagvik, past the modern buildings that housed government offices and research facilities, past the traditional structures that represented the town's whaling heritage, and finally past the cemetery where generations of residents rested beneath wooden crosses that stood in stark silhouette against the star-filled sky. At 6:07 that morning, Daniel reached the transition zone where solid ground gave way to sea ice, a boundary marked by pressure ridges where wind and current had forced ice slabs into jagged formations that resembled frozen mountain ranges in miniature. The sound of the wind changed character as it encountered these ice formations, creating an haunting symphony of whistles and moans that seemed to emanate from the frozen sea itself. Daniel paused at the ice edge to conduct a safety assessment, using his ice spear to test the thickness and stability of the sea ice in several locations. The ice measured 43 inches thick, more than adequate to support his weight and equipment, and showed no signs of the stress fractures or pressure cracks that could indicate unstable conditions. Satisfied with the ice conditions, Daniel began his journey across the frozen surface of the Chukchi Sea, pulling his equipment sled behind him as he navigated between pressure ridges and around areas where wind had scoured the ice into mirror-smooth surfaces that reflected the stars above. His destination was a location approximately 2 miles from shore, where previous expeditions had yielded productive fishing, a spot marked in his GPS unit as Honey Hole 3, and characterized by underwater topography that attracted Arctic char and other cold water species. The journey across the sea ice was expected to take approximately 45 minutes, allowing Daniel to reach his fishing location shortly after 7 o'clock, just as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. What Daniel didn't know, and what wouldn't be discovered until investigators analyzed the GPS tracking data weeks later, was that Bear 47 had detected his scent while he was still loading equipment at Maggie Yuki's cabin, and that the massive predator was already beginning to converge on Daniel's location, using hunting instincts refined by millions of years of evolution. The polar bear's approach was methodical and patient, utilizing the natural features of the sea ice to remain concealed while maintaining a trajectory that would intersect Daniel's intended fishing location. Bear 47 moved in a pattern that kept him downwind of his intended prey, using pressure ridges and wind-blown snowdrifts to mask his approach, while his sensitive nose tracked the increasingly strong scent of human activity. At 6:43 that morning, Daniel reached his intended fishing location and began the process of setting up his portable fish house, a procedure that required approximately 15 minutes of work in the brutal Arctic conditions. The fish house, designed to provide minimal shelter from the wind, consisted of a lightweight aluminum frame covered with insulated fabric panels that could withstand wind speeds up to 60 miles per hour. The process of assembling the fish house required Daniel to remove his insulated mittens and work with his hands exposed to the sub-zero air, a necessary compromise that allowed for the manual dexterity required to connect frame components and secure fabric panels. Even with liner gloves providing some protection, Daniel could feel his fingertips beginning to numb within minutes, a reminder of how quickly the Arctic environment could overwhelm human physiology. While Daniel worked to establish his fishing shelter, Bear 47 had closed the distance to approximately 400 yards, positioning himself behind a pressure ridge that provided complete concealment while offering an unobstructed view of human activity on the ice. The bear's patience was remarkable, representing hunting instincts that had been refined by countless generations of predators who understood that the difference between success and failure often came down to timing and positioning. From his concealed position, Bear 47 could observe every aspect of Daniel's setup routine, from the methodical assembly of the fish house to the process of marking drilling locations on the ice surface. The bear's heightened senses detected not only Daniel's visual presence, but also his scent signature, which had been growing stronger as the morning progressed, and the vibrations transmitted through the sea ice by Daniel's movements and equipment. At 7:02 that morning, Daniel completed the assembly of his fish house and began the process of drilling fishing holes through the sea ice, a procedure that would require approximately 10 minutes using his gas-powered ice auger. The sound of the auger's engine created a mechanical roar that carried clearly through the Arctic air, providing an auditory beacon that could be heard for miles across the frozen landscape. The noise of the ice auger triggered an immediate response from Bear 47, who interpreted the mechanical sounds as potential evidence of seal activity beneath the ice. In the bear's predatory mindset, any disturbance on the sea ice represented a potential feeding opportunity, and the combination of human scent and unusual sounds created an irresistible attraction that overcame the bear's natural caution around unfamiliar situations. Daniel drilled 3 holes through the sea ice, each approximately 8 inches in diameter and extending through 43 inches of ice into the dark waters of the Chukchi Sea below. The drilling process required him to move between locations, creating a pattern of activity that was clearly visible to Bear 47 from his concealed position. By 7:15 that morning, Daniel had completed his drilling and had begun the process of setting up his fishing equipment, threading line through guides that threatened to freeze solid in the sub-zero temperatures, and attaching lures that had been selected specifically for Arctic char and other cold water species known to inhabit the waters beneath the sea ice. The process of preparing fishing equipment in Arctic conditions required constant attention to prevent ice buildup on reels and guides, a maintenance routine that demanded Daniel's complete focus and prevented him from conducting the regular safety sweeps of his surroundings that might have detected Bear 47's presence. At 7:21 that morning, Daniel cast his first line into the dark waters beneath the sea ice, beginning the fishing process that had brought him to this remote location. The waters of the Chukchi Sea beneath the ice maintained a temperature of approximately 29 degrees Fahrenheit, just above the freezing point of salt water, and supported a complex ecosystem of marine life adapted to the extreme conditions. Daniel's fishing technique involved lowering his lure to a depth of approximately 20 feet, then using a series of subtle movements to imitate the behavior of small fish or crustaceans that would attract predatory species. The technique required patience and concentration, qualities that Daniel had developed over decades of fishing in challenging conditions. What Daniel couldn't know was that his fishing activity was creating vibrations through the water that were being detected by Bear 47's sensitive hearing, and that these vibrations were being interpreted as evidence of seal activity beneath the ice. The bear's hunting instincts, sharpened by weeks of unsuccessful hunting attempts, were now fully engaged, and Bear 47 began the final approach toward Daniel's fishing location. At 7:28 that morning, Bear 47 moved from his concealed position behind the pressure ridge and began a direct approach toward Daniel's fish house, covering the 400 yards of sea ice between them with the fluid, purposeful movement of an apex predator closing in on its prey. The bear's approach was initially cautious, utilizing the natural cover provided by wind-blown snow and minor irregularities in the ice surface to remain concealed until the final moments of the encounter. Bear 47's massive paws, equipped with semi-retractable claws designed for maintaining traction on ice, made virtually no sound as they contacted the frozen surface, allowing the 1,200-pound predator to move with surprising stealth despite his enormous size. Daniel remained focused on his fishing, unaware that death was approaching across the sea ice with the inevitability of an Arctic storm. His attention was completely absorbed by the subtle movements of his fishing line and the challenge of maintaining his equipment in conditions that threatened to freeze metal components solid within minutes. At 7:31 that morning, Bear 47 reached a position approximately 100 yards from Daniel's fish house and paused to assess the situation, demonstrating the intelligence and tactical awareness that made polar bears the Arctic's most formidable predator. From this distance, the bear could clearly see Daniel's movements within the fish house and could detect the human scent that had been growing stronger as the morning progressed. The bear's pause at 100 yards represented a critical decision point in the encounter, a moment when Bear 47's natural caution warred with his growing hunger and predatory instincts. Under normal circumstances, a polar bear might observe a human from this distance and choose to withdraw rather than risk a confrontation with an unfamiliar threat. However, Bear 47's desperate nutritional state had altered his normal behavioral patterns, creating a situation where hunger overcame caution. At 7:33 that morning, Bear 47 resumed his approach toward Daniel's fishing location, moving with increased speed and determination as his predatory instincts fully engaged. The bear's movement transitioned from cautious stalking to purposeful hunting, with each stride covering 8 to 10 feet of sea ice, as Bear 47 closed the remaining distance to his intended prey. Daniel's first indication of impending danger came at 7:34 and 12 seconds that morning, when a subtle vibration transmitted through the sea ice caused him to glance up from his fishing line. The vibration was barely perceptible, more a change in the quality of the ice beneath his feet than an actual movement, but something about the sensation triggered an instinctive warning that caused Daniel to set down his fishing rod and step outside his fish house to scan his surroundings. The Arctic landscape that greeted Daniel's eyes appeared unchanged from his earlier observations. Endless expanses of white ice, broken by pressure ridges and wind-sculpted snow formations, all beneath a sky that was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. Nothing in the visible environment suggested immediate danger, and Daniel began to convince himself that the vibration had been caused by natural settling of the sea ice or distant pressure changes that regularly affected the frozen surface. At 7:34 and 47 seconds that morning, Bear 47 reached a position 50 yards from Daniel's fish house and abandoned all pretense of concealment, rising to his full height on his hind legs to assess the hunting situation. At 12 feet tall when standing upright, Bear 47 represented one of nature's most impressive predators, a creature perfectly adapted for survival in conditions that would kill most other mammals within hours. Daniel's second warning came in the form of a massive shadow that seemed to materialize against the brightening eastern sky, a silhouette so large and unexpected that Daniel's mind initially refused to process what his eyes were seeing. For a moment that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but felt like an eternity, Daniel stared at the enormous figure on the horizon, his brain struggling to reconcile the impossibility of what appeared to be a creature from prehistoric nightmares, standing on the sea ice less than 50 yards from his fishing location. Recognition came with a flood of adrenaline that caused Daniel's heart rate to spike from its normal 72 beats per minute to over 160 beats per minute in the space of seconds, triggering physiological changes that would prove inadequate for the challenge he was about to face. His hands began to shake, not from cold, but from the primitive fear response that had kept human ancestors alive when confronted by large predators, and his mouth became dry despite the sub-zero air that should have preserved moisture on his lips and tongue. At 7:35 and 3 seconds that morning, Bear 47 dropped to all fours and began the final charge toward Daniel's fishing location, covering the remaining 50 yards of sea ice with a speed and power that defied his massive size. A polar bear at full charge can reach speeds of 25 miles per hour, even on ice, and Bear 47's desperate hunger provided additional motivation that increased his speed to nearly 30 miles per hour as he closed the distance to his intended prey. Daniel's survival training, accumulated over 7 years of Arctic fishing expeditions, kicked in with automatic responses that might have saved his life under different circumstances. His first action was to retreat toward his fish house, seeking the minimal shelter it might provide, while his hands fumbled for the emergency radio that represented his only means of summoning help in the remote location. The VHF radio, a Motorola model designed for maritime emergency communications, required approximately 4 seconds to power up and achieve signal lock. 4 seconds that Daniel no longer possessed as Bear 47's charge brought the massive predator across the sea ice with devastating efficiency. At 7:35 and 18 seconds that morning, Daniel managed to activate his emergency radio and began transmitting a distress call on Channel 16, the international emergency frequency monitored by the Coast Guard and other rescue agencies. His voice, high-pitched with terror but still comprehensible, would later be analyzed by investigators as one of the most harrowing emergency transmissions ever recorded in Alaska. Mayday, 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 this is Daniel Kowalski at position. Daniel's transmission was interrupted as Bear 47 reached his fishing location and delivered a massive blow that sent Daniel flying 15 feet across the sea ice, separating him from his radio and beginning the attack sequence that would claim his life in the next 5 minutes and 46 seconds. The initial impact from Bear 47's paw, which struck Daniel in the center of his back with approximately 800 pounds of force, resulted in immediate spinal compression injuries and internal bleeding that would have proven fatal even without the subsequent attack. Daniel's heavy Arctic clothing provided some protection against the bear's claws, but the sheer force of the impact was sufficient to cause multiple rib fractures and damage to internal organs. Daniel's second transmission, made after he had rolled across the ice and managed to retrieve his radio, was barely coherent due to the physical trauma he had already sustained and the psychological shock of being attacked by one of nature's most formidable predators. Polar bear attack, polar bear attack. I'm 2 miles northeast of Barrow. I'm hurt bad. Send help immediately. This transmission was received by the United States Coast Guard Communication Center in Kodiak, Alaska, approximately 800 miles southeast of Daniel's position, and was immediately relayed to rescue coordination centers throughout the state. The timestamp on the Coast Guard's communication log would later establish that Daniel's distress call was received at 7:35 and 34 seconds Alaska Standard Time, providing investigators with a precise timeline for the beginning of the attack sequence. Bear 47's second assault on Daniel came 15 seconds after the initial contact, as the massive predator used his powerful jaws to grab Daniel by the left leg and begin dragging him away from his fishing equipment and toward a pressure ridge approximately 200 yards from the original attack site. The bear's jaws, capable of exerting crushing pressure exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, immediately fractured Daniel's femur and caused massive tissue damage that resulted in arterial bleeding. Daniel's screams of pain and terror, audible despite the howling Arctic wind, created an eerie soundtrack that would haunt the dreams of rescue personnel who would later listen to recorded radio transmissions from the scene. The combination of physical agony and absolute terror produced vocalizations that seemed to come from some primordial part of the human experience, sounds that represented the ultimate expression of mortality in the face of an apex predator. The process of being dragged across sea ice by a 1,200-pound polar bear resulted in additional injuries as Daniel's body was pulled over irregular ice formations and through areas where wind had created abrasive surfaces that tore at his protective clothing. The friction between Daniel's body and the ice surface generated heat that actually caused localized melting, creating a trail that would later be used by investigators to reconstruct the exact path of the attack. At 7:36 and 12 seconds that morning, Daniel managed to grab his radio one final time and transmit what would be his last coherent message to the outside world. His voice, weakened by blood loss and distorted by pain, nevertheless conveyed crucial information about his location and the nature of his situation. "This is Daniel Kowalski. I'm being dragged by a polar bear. I'm bleeding bad. Coordinate north 71 degrees, 22 minutes, 47 seconds, west 156 degrees, 45 minutes, 12 seconds. Tell my wife I love her." This final transmission provided rescue coordinators with precise GPS coordinates for Daniel's location, information that would prove crucial for the subsequent search and recovery operation. However, the coordinates also confirmed what rescue personnel had already suspected based on the remote location. No rescue aircraft could reach Daniel's position in time to save his life, even under optimal conditions. The United States Coast Guard's nearest helicopter rescue asset was based in Kotzebue, Alaska, approximately 230 miles southeast of Daniel's position, requiring a minimum flight time of 90 minutes under perfect weather conditions. The current weather conditions, with winds gusting to 45 miles per hour and visibility reduced by blowing snow, would extend the flight time to at least 2 hours, assuming that flight operations were even possible in such conditions. Bear 47 continued dragging Daniel across the sea ice for approximately 4 minutes, covering a distance of nearly quarter mile as the massive predator sought a location where he could feed without interference. The bear's behavior during this phase of the attack demonstrated the intelligence and tactical awareness that made polar bears such effective predators, as Bear 47 selected a feeding site behind a large pressure ridge that provided concealment from potential threats, while offering multiple escape routes if the situation changed. At 7:38 and 41 seconds that morning, Bear 47 released his grip on Daniel's leg and began the feeding behavior that would claim Daniel's life in the next 2 minutes and 33 seconds. The bear's first action was to use his massive jaws to crush Daniel's skull, an attack that resulted in immediate loss of consciousness and massive brain trauma that ended any possibility of survival. The feeding process that followed was characterized by the methodical efficiency that had allowed polar bears to survive in the Arctic for thousands of years, with Bear 47 consuming the most nutritionally valuable portions of his prey while remaining alert for potential threats that might force him to abandon his meal. The bear's acute hearing monitored the approaching sounds of rescue aircraft, while his powerful jaws and teeth reduced Daniel's body to scattered remains that would later challenge even experienced investigators. At 7:41 and 14 seconds that morning, the sound of approaching helicopter rotors caused Bear 47 to abandon his feeding and retreat toward the pressure ridges that provided concealment and escape routes. The bear's withdrawal from Daniel's remains was reluctant, as Bear 47's desperate nutritional state made abandoning any food source a difficult decision. But the approaching aircraft represented a potential threat that overrode the bear's feeding instincts. The first aircraft to reach Daniel's location was a Bell 212 helicopter operated by ERA Helicopters, an Alaska-based company that provided emergency medical services and search and rescue operations throughout the state. The helicopter, piloted by Captain Marcus "Mac" Thompson, a 47-year-old former military aviator with over 20 years of experience in Arctic rescue operations, had been dispatched from Utqiagvik within minutes of receiving Daniel's distress call. Captain Thompson's initial assessment of the scene, transmitted to rescue coordinators via radio, provided the first official confirmation of Daniel's fate. Arctic Rescue 1 to rescue coordination, we have eyes on the scene, and it's not good. We have scattered remains across approximately half a mile of sea ice, and a very large polar bear retreating toward pressure ridges approximately 400 yards northeast of the debris field. The helicopter's arrival also triggered a response from Bear 47, who had never encountered aircraft at close range, but whose predatory instincts identified the helicopter as a potential threat to his claimed territory. The bear's behavior during the helicopter's approach demonstrated the aggressive territoriality that had made him such an effective predator, as Bear 47 actually advanced toward the aircraft, while displaying threatening postures that included rearing on his hind legs and vocalizing challenges that could be heard over the helicopter's engines. Captain Thompson, whose experience with Arctic wildlife had taught him to respect the capabilities of polar bears, maintained a safe distance from Bear 47 while conducting his assessment of the scene. The helicopter's presence prevented any possibility of ground-based rescue operations, as the bear's aggressive behavior made it clear that Bear 47 considered the entire area his territory and would defend it against any intrusion. The radio communications between Captain Thompson and rescue coordination centers during the initial assessment phase provided a detailed record of the scene that would later be used by investigators to reconstruct the attack sequence. Thompson's training as a military aviator had taught him to observe and report details with clinical precision, even when confronted with scenes of extreme violence and tragedy. Rescue coordination. Be advised that we have extensive remains scattered across multiple impact sites, consistent with predation by a large carnivore, Thompson reported at 7:43 and 28 seconds that morning. The primary concentration of remains is located behind a pressure ridge approximately 200 yards northeast of what appears to be the initial attack site, based on equipment scattered across the ice and blood trail evidence. Thompson's report also included detailed observations of Bear 47's size and behavior, information that would prove crucial for wildlife management decisions in the aftermath of the attack. The bear responsible for this incident is an adult male, estimated weight 1,200 pounds or more, extremely aggressive and territorial. The animal has made several mock charges toward our aircraft and shows no signs of retreating from the scene. The helicopter's fuel limitations, combined with the deteriorating weather conditions and Bear 47's aggressive presence, forced Captain Thompson to withdraw from the immediate area after approximately 8 minutes of observation. The decision to withdraw was made reluctantly, as Thompson's military training emphasized the importance of never abandoning fallen comrades. But the practical realities of Arctic rescue operations made extended loitering impossible. As Captain Thompson's helicopter departed Daniels' location to refuel and resupply, additional rescue assets were being mobilized throughout Alaska in response to what had become the state's most significant polar bear attack in over a decade. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game dispatched wildlife enforcement officers with specialized equipment for dealing with aggressive polar bears, while the Alaska State Troopers activated their tactical response team for potential recovery operations in a hostile environment. The coordination of multiple rescue agencies was handled by the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center in Elmendorf Air Force Base, where Major Patricia Pat Williams, a 34-year-old Air Force officer with extensive experience in Arctic search and rescue operations, assumed command of what would become known as Operation Polar Recovery. Major Williams's first challenge was developing a tactical approach for recovering Daniels' remains while minimizing risk to rescue personnel and managing the ongoing threat posed by Bear 47. The bear's aggressive territoriality and desperate hunger made conventional recovery operations impossible, requiring the development of specialized procedures that had never been attempted in Alaska. "This is unlike anything we've dealt with before," Major Williams explained during a briefing session held at 7:59 that morning, approximately 18 minutes after Daniels' death. "We have a 1,200-pound polar bear that has claimed a large territory around the victim's remains, and the bear is showing extreme aggression toward any approach by aircraft or personnel. Standard protocols for wildlife management in recovery operations are not applicable when dealing with a bear of this size and aggression level." The tactical solution developed by Major Williams involved a coordinated approach using multiple aircraft and specialized personnel trained in Arctic wildlife management. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game provided Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a 39-year-old wildlife biologist specializing in polar bear behavior, who would serve as the tactical advisor for all operations involving Bear 47. Dr. Martinez had spent 12 years studying polar bear behavior throughout Alaska and the Canadian Arctic, and her expertise would prove crucial in predicting Bear 47's responses to various tactical approaches. Her analysis of the bear's behavior, based on Captain Thompson's radio reports and subsequent aerial observations, suggested that Bear 47's extreme territoriality was driven by desperate hunger rather than normal predatory behavior. A bear of this size shouldn't be showing this level of aggression unless he's facing starvation conditions. Doctor Martinez explained during the tactical briefing. The fact that he's defending the remains against aircraft suggests that this feeding opportunity represents critical survival resources for him. We're not dealing with normal polar bear behavior patterns here. The tactical plan, developed by Major Williams and Dr. Martinez, involved using multiple aircraft to approach Bear 47's location from different directions simultaneously, creating confusion and forcing the bear to divide his attention between multiple potential threats. The plan also included provisions for using non-lethal deterrents, including rubber bullets and noise-making devices, to force Bear 47 away from Daniel's remains without killing an endangered species. The implementation of Operation Polar Recovery began at 8:17 that morning, approximately 36 minutes after Daniel's death, when 3 aircraft converged on his location from different compass directions. The formation included Captain Thompson's Bell 212 helicopter, a second helicopter operated by Guardian Flight Emergency Medical Services, and a fixed-wing aircraft operated by the Civil Air Patrol that would provide aerial coordination and photography of the operation. Bear 47's response to the multi-aircraft approach demonstrated the intelligence and adaptability that had made him such an effective predator throughout his 15 to 18-year lifespan. Rather than fleeing from the coordinated aircraft approach, Bear 47 positioned himself at the center of Daniel's scattered remains and adopted defensive postures that made it clear he would fight to retain his claimed territory. The bear's defensive behavior included vocalizations that could be heard over aircraft engines, physical displays that involved rearing to his full 12-foot height while standing on his hind legs, and aggressive movements toward whichever aircraft approached closest to his position. The combination of size, aggression, and tactical awareness displayed by Bear 47 created a situation that challenged every protocol developed for wildlife management in recovery operations. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the pilot of the Guardian flight helicopter, provided radio commentary that captured the unprecedented nature of the situation facing rescue personnel. "I've been flying rescue operations in Alaska for 14 years, and I've never seen anything like this. This bear is not showing normal fear responses to aircraft, and he's demonstrating territorial behavior that suggests he views this entire area as his domain." Although the stalemate between rescue aircraft and Bear 47 continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which time fuel limitations and deteriorating weather conditions threatened to force a withdrawal of all rescue assets. The wind had increased to sustained speeds of 48 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour, creating conditions that approached the operational limits for helicopter flights in the Arctic environment. At 8:39 that morning, Dr. Martinez made the tactical decision to authorize the use of rubber bullets and noise-making devices in an attempt to drive Bear 47 away from Daniel's remains without causing permanent harm to the endangered predator. The decision represented a compromise between the need to recover Daniel's body and the legal requirements for protecting polar bears under the Endangered Species Act. The implementation of non-lethal deterrents began with the deployment of noise-making devices designed to create loud explosions that would startle Bear 47 and potentially trigger his flight response. The devices, known as bear bangers, produced explosions equivalent to large fireworks and had proven effective in driving polar bears away from human settlements in previous incidents. Bear 47's response to the noise-making devices defied all previous experience with polar bear behavior, as the massive predator actually moved closer to Daniel's remains and increased his aggressive displays rather than retreating from the perceived threat. The bear's behavior suggested that his desperate nutritional state had overridden normal fear responses and created a situation where Bear 47 was prepared to fight any threat to retain access to critical food resources. The failure of noise-making devices to deter Bear 47 led Dr. Martinez to authorize the use of rubber bullets, non-lethal projectiles designed to cause temporary pain and disorientation without inflicting permanent injury. The rubber bullets were fired from specialized weapons operated by Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement officers aboard Captain Thompson's helicopter. The first rubber bullet struck Bear 47 in the shoulder, causing the massive predator to roar in pain and anger while spinning to face the source of the attack. Rather than fleeing, Bear 47's response was to charge directly toward Captain Thompson's helicopter, forcing the pilot to execute evasive maneuvers that brought the aircraft dangerously close to the sea ice surface. "He's charging us! He's charging us!" Captain Thompson's voice over the radio conveyed the unprecedented nature of Bear 47's aggressive response to non-lethal deterrence. "This bear is not behaving like any polar bear I've encountered in 20 years of Arctic flying. He's actually attacking aircraft." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as Bear 47's charges forced rescue helicopters to maintain increasingly greater distances from Daniel's remains, making any recovery operation impossible while also consuming fuel at accelerated rates due to the evasive maneuvers required to avoid the bear's attacks. At 8:47 that morning, Major Williams made the difficult decision to authorize the use of lethal force against Bear 47, a decision that violated standard protocols for protecting endangered species, but was deemed necessary to protect rescue personnel and recover Daniel's remains. The authorization for lethal force was transmitted to Dr. Martinez aboard Captain Thompson's helicopter, along with specific instructions for ensuring that the shooting would be conducted by qualified personnel using appropriate weapons. The weapon selected for eliminating Bear 47 was a Remington Model 700 rifle chambered in .375, Holland and Holland Magnum, a caliber specifically recommended for hunting large, dangerous game in Alaska. The rifle was operated by Officer Michael "Mike" Stevens, a 41-year-old Alaska Department of Fish and Game Enforcement officer with extensive experience in wildlife control operations throughout the state. Officer Stevens had been involved in polar bear management operations for over 15 years, including several incidents where bears had been killed in defense of human life or property. However, the current situation represented the most challenging shot of his career, as the combination of helicopter movement, wind conditions, and Bear 47's aggressive behavior created targeting conditions that pushed the limits of long-range precision shooting. The first shot, fired at 8:49 and 12 seconds that morning from a range of approximately 150 yards, struck Bear 47 in the chest and delivered enough kinetic energy to knock the massive predator to the ground. However, the bear's size and physical condition allowed him to absorb the impact and return to his feet within seconds, at which point Bear 47 resumed his aggressive displays and territorial behavior. Officer Stevens's second shot, fired 18 seconds after the first, struck Bear 47 in the head and delivered the instantaneous brain trauma necessary to stop a predator of such size and determination. The shot was precisely placed despite the challenging conditions, demonstrating the skill level required for wildlife enforcement operations in Alaska's most remote regions. Bear 47's death at 8:49 and 30 seconds that morning marked the end of the immediate threat to rescue personnel and allowed for the beginning of recovery operations to locate and collect Daniel's remains. However, the process of recovering human remains from a polar bear attack site presented unique challenges that required specialized expertise and equipment. The recovery operation was led by Dr. Amanda Foster, a 43-year-old forensic anthropologist from the Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office, who had extensive experience in processing remains from wildlife attacks and other traumatic incidents. Dr. Foster's expertise would prove crucial in identifying and collecting Daniel's remains from a scene that had been scattered across nearly half a mile of sea ice by Bear 47's feeding behavior. The initial assessment of the recovery site, conducted from helicopter overflights beginning at 8:52 that morning, revealed the extent of the challenge facing forensic recovery teams. Daniel's remains had been scattered across multiple locations, with the primary concentration located behind the pressure ridge where Bear 47 had conducted his feeding, and secondary scatter patterns extending along the route where Daniel had been dragged from his original fishing location. "We're looking at a recovery site that extends across approximately 2,000 square meters of sea ice," Dr. Foster reported during her initial aerial survey. "The remains have been scattered by both predator feeding behavior and Arctic wind conditions, creating a complex forensic scene that will require systematic grid searches to ensure complete recovery." The process of establishing a secure perimeter around the recovery site began at 9:07 that morning, when Alaska State Trooper personnel, armed with high-powered rifles, took positions around the scattered remains to provide security against other polar bears that might be attracted to the scene. The presence of human remains and bear carcass created scent signatures that could potentially draw additional predators from distances of several miles, requiring constant vigilance throughout the recovery operation. The actual process of collecting Daniel's remains began at 9:23 that morning and continued for the next 4 hours and 17 minutes, as forensic recovery teams worked systematically across the frozen landscape to locate and document every piece of evidence related to the attack. The work was conducted in conditions that challenged both human endurance and forensic protocols, as temperatures of -31 degrees Fahrenheit and wind speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour created an environment where exposed skin could suffer frostbite within minutes. Dr. Foster's team utilized GPS technology to create precise maps of the recovery site, documenting the location and condition of every piece of evidence collected during the operation. The mapping process would later prove crucial for investigators attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events during Bear 47's attack on Daniel. The forensic evidence collected during the recovery operation included not only Daniel's remains, but also samples of bear fur, blood evidence from multiple locations, photographs documenting the condition and location of recovered materials, and measurements of bear tracks and other physical evidence that would support the investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack. The most challenging aspect of the recovery operation involved collecting remains from locations where Bear 47's feeding behavior had scattered biological material across areas of rough ice that were difficult to access safely. Recovery teams worked in pairs, with one team member conducting searches while a second team member maintained constant communication with security personnel and helicopter support assets. The completion of the recovery operation at 13:40 that afternoon marked the end of the immediate response phase of what would become one of Alaska's most extensively investigated polar bear attacks. Daniel's remains were transported to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's Office in Anchorage for detailed forensic analysis, while Bear 47's carcass was transferred to wildlife research facilities for necropsy examination and scientific study. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Daniel's death began immediately following the completion of recovery operations, with investigators from multiple agencies working to understand how a routine ice fishing expedition had resulted in such a catastrophic encounter with Alaska's most dangerous predator. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Lieutenant Robert Bob Harrison, a 23-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers with extensive experience in remote area investigations and wildlife-related fatalities. Lieutenant Harrison's investigation would ultimately encompass interviews with dozens of witnesses, analysis of extensive forensic evidence, and consultation with wildlife behavior experts from around the world. The initial phase of Lieutenant Harrison's investigation focused on reconstructing Daniel's activities during the hours leading up to the attack, beginning with his departure from Maggie Uki's rental cabin at approximately 5:15 that morning. The investigation revealed that Daniel had followed his normal routine for Arctic fishing expeditions, with one critical exception: his decision to leave defensive equipment behind in favor of traveling light across the sea ice. The discovery that Daniel had left both bear spray and his .44 Magnum revolver in his cabin represented a crucial finding in the investigation, as either defensive tool might have provided enough deterrent effect to prevent or interrupt Bear 47's attack. Wildlife experts consulted during the investigation agreed that bear spray would likely have been effective against Bear 47 during the initial phases of the encounter, before the bear's predatory instincts became fully engaged. Dr. Martinez, the wildlife biologist who had served as tactical advisor during the recovery operation, provided expert analysis of Bear 47's behavior that helped explain why the attack had occurred despite Daniel's 7 years of experience fishing in polar bear territory. Bear 47's tracking data shows that he hadn't had a successful hunt in over 6 weeks, which placed him in a desperate nutritional state, Dr. Martinez explained during her interview with Lieutenant Harrison. A bear facing starvation will take risks and display aggression levels that would never be seen under normal circumstances. Daniel had the misfortune to encounter a polar bear that was literally fighting for his own survival. The investigation also revealed that Bear 47 had been monitored by wildlife researchers for the previous 3 years, during which time his behavior patterns had been well within normal ranges for adult male polar bears in the Chukchi Sea region. The tracking data showed that Bear 47 typically maintained territories covering approximately 100 square miles and followed predictable hunting patterns that rarely brought him into contact with human activities. The change in Bear 47's behavior during the weeks leading up to the attack was attributed to environmental factors that had reduced seal populations in his normal hunting areas, forcing the desperate predator to expand his search patterns into areas where he might encounter human activity. Dr. Rodriguez, the USGS biologist responsible for monitoring Bear 47's movements, provided investigators with detailed analysis of the bear's GPS tracking data that helped establish a timeline for the events leading up to the attack. The tracking data shows that Bear 47 had been moving continuously for the past 2 weeks, covering distances of 30 to 40 miles per day in what appears to have been systematic search patterns, Dr. Rodriguez testified. This level of activity is highly unusual for polar bears during winter months and suggests that Bear 47 was unable to locate adequate food sources in his normal hunting areas. The forensic analysis of Daniel's remains, conducted by Dr. Patricia Chen, the Alaska State Medical Examiner, provided detailed information about the sequence of injuries that had caused his death. The forensic evidence supported witness accounts and radio transmissions that indicated Daniel had survived the initial attack and had attempted to call for help before succumbing to massive trauma caused by Bear 47's predatory behavior. The victim sustained multiple trauma injuries consistent with attack by a large predator, Dr. Chen reported in her official findings. The initial injuries were survivable and consistent with defensive wounds, but subsequent predatory feeding behavior resulted in massive tissue damage and exsanguination that would have caused death within minutes. The forensic analysis also revealed that Daniel had been conscious during at least part of Bear 47's attack, a finding that added to the psychological impact of the incident on rescue personnel and investigators who had listened to Daniel's final radio transmissions. The investigation into Daniel's death was completed after 6 weeks of intensive work by multiple agencies, resulting in a comprehensive report that was distributed to wildlife management agencies throughout Alaska and the Arctic regions of Canada. The report included recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future, including enhanced public education about polar bear safety and improved protocols for recreational activities in polar bear habitat. The investigation's findings were also incorporated into training programs for rescue personnel and wildlife enforcement officers, ensuring that the lessons learned from Daniel's death would benefit future emergency response operations in Alaska's remote regions. The media coverage of Daniel's death began within hours of the initial distress call and continued for several weeks as details of the attack and recovery operation became public. The story attracted national and international attention due to the rare nature of fatal polar bear attacks and the remote location where the incident occurred. The first media reports were broadcast by local television stations in Anchorage and Fairbanks, based on information released by the Alaska State Troopers and the Coast Guard. These initial reports were necessarily limited due to the ongoing rescue and recovery operations, but they established the basic facts of the incident and generated immediate public interest in the story. National media coverage began on the evening of January 5th, when major television networks picked up the story based on reports from their Alaska affiliates. The story was featured on evening news broadcasts throughout the United States, with particular attention paid to the remote location of the attack and the challenges faced by rescue personnel. The most extensive media coverage was provided by CNN, which assigned correspondent Lisa Matthews to travel to Utqiagvik and provide on-location reporting about the incident and its impact on the local community. Matthews' reporting included interviews with local residents, wildlife experts, and rescue personnel who had participated in the recovery operation. This incident represents one of the most remote and challenging rescue operations ever conducted in Alaska, Matthews reported during a live broadcast from Utqiagvik on January 7th. The combination of extreme weather conditions, aggressive wildlife, and the vast distances involved in Arctic rescue operations created a situation that pushed emergency response capabilities to their absolute limits. International media attention was generated by the rarity of fatal polar bear attacks and the broader implications of the incident for Arctic wildlife management. The story was covered by major news organizations in Canada, the United Kingdom, and other countries with Arctic territories, often with emphasis on the relationship between climate change and polar bear behavior. The BBC's coverage of the story included interviews with polar bear researchers from around the world who provided context for understanding the environmental factors that may have contributed to Bear 47's desperate condition and aggressive behavior. Polar bears are facing unprecedented challenges due to changing Arctic conditions, explained Dr. Michael Thompson, a polar bear researcher from the University of Aberdeen who was interviewed by the BBC. While we cannot directly attribute this specific incident to climate change, the broader environmental pressures facing polar bear populations are creating conditions where desperate bears may take greater risks in their search for food. The media coverage of Daniel's death also generated discussion about the ethics and safety of recreational activities in polar bear habitat, with wildlife experts offering various perspectives on how such incidents might be prevented in the future. Some experts advocated for stricter regulations governing recreational activities in polar bear territory, arguing that the risks to both humans and endangered polar bears were too great to justify activities like solo ice fishing in remote locations. Other experts emphasized the importance of education and proper safety equipment, arguing that experienced outdoors enthusiasts should be allowed to accept calculated risks as long as they were properly prepared and equipped for potential wildlife encounters. The debate over recreational access to polar bear habitat continued in editorial pages and online forums for several weeks after Daniel's death, reflecting broader societal discussions about the relationship between human activities and wildlife conservation in the Arctic. Rebecca Kowalski's first notification of her husband's death came through a phone call from the Alaska State Troopers at 11:23 that morning, approximately 4 hours after Daniel's final radio transmission. The call was handled by Trooper Sergeant Jennifer Adams, a crisis intervention specialist trained to deliver death notifications to family members of incident victims. Rebecca was at work at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin when she received the call, and her initial reaction was disbelief that such a thing could happen to someone with Daniel's experience and knowledge of Arctic conditions. Danny was so careful about safety, Rebecca told investigators during her interview 3 days after the incident. He had all the right equipment. He knew about polar bears. He had been making these trips for 7 years without any problems. I keep thinking there must be some mistake, that maybe he's just injured and waiting for rescue somewhere. The process of accepting Daniel's death was complicated by the remote location where it occurred and the unusual circumstances of the attack. Rebecca's grief was accompanied by anger at Daniel for taking unnecessary risks and by guilt about her failure to prevent him from making what would prove to be his final expedition to Alaska. Rebecca's reaction to Daniel's death was shared by other family members, including Daniel's parents and sisters, who struggled to understand how their careful, experienced relative could have been killed by a wild animal in one of the most remote locations in North America. The funeral arrangements for Daniel were complicated by the condition of his remains and the need to coordinate transportation from Alaska to Wisconsin. The process of preparing Daniel's body for burial required specialized forensic procedures due to the traumatic nature of his death, and the family was advised that a closed casket service would be most appropriate. Daniel's funeral was held at St. Stanislaus Catholic Church in Milwaukee on January 14th, 9 days after his death, and was attended by more than 400 people, including family members, friends, co-workers, and members of the fishing community who had known Daniel through his various expeditions and competitions. The eulogy was delivered by Father Thomas Kowalski, Daniel's cousin, who had served as a priest for 26 years and had officiated at numerous funerals for family members and parishioners. Father Kowalski's eulogy emphasized Daniel's passion for adventure and his dedication to pursuing experiences that challenged his physical and mental capabilities. Daniel lived his life with a passion for exploration that took him to places most of us will never see, Father Kowalski said during the service. His death in the Arctic is a tragedy, but it occurred while he was pursuing the activities that gave his life meaning and purpose. We should honor his memory by remembering the joy he found in adventure and the courage he showed in pursuing his dreams. The financial impact of Daniel's death on his family was significant, as his income as a commercial refrigeration technician had provided the primary support for the household, while Rebecca worked part-time as a nurse practitioner. The costs associated with recovering Daniel's remains from Alaska and transporting them to Wisconsin for burial added additional financial stress to an already difficult situation. A fund was established by Daniel's co-workers and members of the local fishing community to help Rebecca with funeral expenses and other financial needs during the transition period following her husband's death. The fund ultimately raised over $40,000, allowing Rebecca to take extended time off from work to process her grief and make necessary adjustments to her living situation. The psychological impact of Daniel's death extended beyond his immediate family to include rescue personnel, investigators, and community members who had been involved in various aspects of the incident. The traumatic nature of the attack and recovery operation had created secondary trauma effects that required professional counseling and support services. Captain Thompson, the helicopter pilot, who had been first to reach Daniel's location, experienced recurring nightmares and anxiety symptoms that interfered with his ability to continue flying rescue operations. His symptoms were diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder related to the visual and auditory memories of the attack scene, and he required 6 months of therapy and medication before returning to active flying duties. Dr. Foster, the forensic anthropologist who had supervised the recovery of Daniel's remains, also experienced psychological effects related to the traumatic nature of the scene and the challenges of working in such extreme conditions. Her symptoms included sleep disturbances, increased anxiety, and difficulty concentrating on other forensic cases that reminded her of the polar bear attack. The community of Utqiagvik was also affected by Daniel's death, as local residents grappled with the implications of such a violent incident occurring in their traditional hunting and fishing areas. The attack raised concerns about changing polar bear behavior and the safety of traditional subsistence activities that had been practiced in the region for thousands of years. Thomas Brower Jr., who had spoken with Daniel on the morning of the attack, experienced significant guilt about his failure to prevent Daniel from venturing onto the sea ice alone. Thomas's cultural background had taught him the importance of community safety in Arctic environments, and he felt that he should have done more to dissuade Daniel from making the solo expedition. In our culture, nobody goes out on the ice alone, Thomas explained during a community meeting held 2 weeks after the attack. We have protocols that have kept our people safe for generations, and when we see someone violating those protocols, we have a responsibility to intervene. I should have insisted that Daniel wait for company, or at least take someone with him. The long-term effects of Daniel's death on the Utqiagvik community included changes in local policies regarding recreational activities on sea ice and enhanced cooperation between local residents and visiting researchers or adventurers. The community established protocols for sharing information about ice conditions and wildlife activity with visitors, while also emphasizing the importance of traditional safety practices. The impact of Daniel's death on polar bear research and management extended throughout Alaska and into the broader scientific community studying Arctic wildlife. The incident provided researchers with valuable data about polar bear behavior under extreme stress conditions, while also raising questions about the effectiveness of current management strategies for protecting both humans and endangered polar bears. Dr. Martinez, the wildlife biologist who had provided tactical advice during the recovery operation, used the incident as a case study for developing improved protocols for managing aggressive polar bears in emergency situations. Her research based on the Bear 47 incident was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and became a standard reference for wildlife enforcement officers throughout the Arctic. The tracking data from Bear 47's GPS collar provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the movement patterns and behavior of a polar bear facing starvation conditions. The data showed that Bear 47 had covered over 800 miles during the 6 weeks prior to the attack, following search patterns that demonstrated remarkable intelligence and adaptability in response to changing environmental conditions. Analysis of Bear 47's tracking data also revealed that the bear had encountered human activity on at least 3 previous occasions during the weeks leading up to the attack, but had chosen to avoid contact in each case. The progression from avoidance to aggressive predation suggested that Bear 47's nutritional condition had deteriorated significantly during his unsuccessful hunting attempts. The necropsy examination of Bear 47's carcass, conducted by veterinary pathologists from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, confirmed that the bear had been in severely compromised physical condition at the time of the attack. Bear 47's body weight was approximately 30% below normal for a polar bear of his size and age, indicating prolonged nutritional stress that would have affected his behavior and decision-making capabilities. "This bear was literally starving to death," explained Dr. Susan Williams, the veterinary pathologist who conducted Bear 47's necropsy examination. His fat reserves were almost completely depleted, and his muscle mass showed signs of protein catabolism that occurs when bears are forced to hibernate, metabolize their own tissue for energy. Under these conditions, normal behavioral patterns become unreliable, and desperate bears will take risks they would never consider under normal circumstances. The scientific data derived from Bear 47's case was incorporated into computer models used to predict polar bear behavior and population dynamics under various environmental scenarios. The models suggested that incidents similar to Daniel's death might become more frequent if environmental changes continued to reduce the availability of traditional prey species for polar bear populations. The legal implications of Daniel's death were relatively limited, as the incident occurred in a remote location where no criminal activity was suspected and where the attacking animal was a protected species acting according to natural predatory instincts. However, the case did generate discussion about liability issues related to recreational activities in polar bear habitat. Some legal experts suggested that government agencies responsible for managing polar bear populations might face liability claims from families of attack victims if adequate warnings about dangerous bears were not provided to the public. The question of whether Bear 47's known aggressive behavior and desperate condition should have resulted in public warnings was debated in legal and wildlife management circles. Other legal experts argued that recreational activities in polar bear habitat were inherently dangerous and that participants assumed responsibility for their own safety when choosing to enter such environments. The principle of assumption of risk was generally considered applicable to cases like Daniel's death, where an experienced outdoorsman had voluntarily entered a known dangerous environment. The insurance implications of Daniel's death were straightforward, as his life insurance policy included coverage for death resulting from accidents during recreational activities. However, the insurance company conducted its own investigation into the circumstances of Daniel's death to verify that the incident had occurred as reported and that no excluded activities were involved. The workers' compensation implications were more complex, as Daniel had been on personal leave from his job as a commercial refrigeration technician when the attack occurred. While his death was clearly not work-related, his employer provided support to Rebecca through company-sponsored grief counseling services and extended health insurance coverage. The civil litigation potential related to Daniel's death was considered minimal, as no party other than Daniel himself could be considered responsible for the circumstances that led to the attack. The remote location and the involvement of protected wildlife created a situation where traditional negligence theories were not applicable. The regulatory response to Daniel's death included reviews of existing policies governing recreational activities in polar bear habitat and consideration of enhanced safety requirements for visitors to Arctic regions. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game conducted a comprehensive review of current polar bear management policies to determine whether changes were needed to prevent similar incidents. The federal agencies responsible for protecting polar bears under the Endangered Species Act also reviewed their policies regarding public access to polar bear habitat and the provision of safety information to recreational users. The review concluded that existing policies were adequate, but that enhanced public education efforts were needed to ensure that visitors to polar bear habitat understood the risks involved. The international implications of Daniel's death were discussed at meetings of the Polar Bear Specialist Group, an international organization of researchers and managers responsible for coordinating polar bear conservation efforts across the Arctic. The group used Daniel's case as an example of the complex challenges involved in balancing human safety with wildlife conservation in changing Arctic environments. The educational impact of Daniel's death was significant, as the incident became a case study used in wilderness safety courses, wildlife management training programs, and Arctic survival instruction throughout North America. The detailed documentation of the attack sequence and recovery operation provided valuable learning materials for professionals who might face similar situations in the future. Universities offering programs in wildlife biology, emergency management, and outdoor recreation incorporated Daniel's case into their curricula as an example of the complex interactions between human activities and wildlife behavior in extreme environments. The case provided students with realistic examples of how theoretical knowledge about animal behavior and emergency response procedures are applied in actual field situations. The media attention generated by Daniel's death also served an educational function by raising public awareness about polar bear safety and the challenges facing Arctic wildlife populations. The extensive coverage helped educate the general public about polar bear behavior, the risks associated with recreational activities in polar bear habitat, and the complex environmental factors affecting polar bear populations. The training implications for rescue personnel were incorporated into emergency response protocols throughout Alaska and other Arctic regions. Daniel's case demonstrated the unique challenges involved in conducting rescue operations in polar bear habitat and led to the development of new tactical procedures for dealing with aggressive wildlife during emergency situations. The psychological support services developed in response to Daniel's incident became a model for providing mental health assistance to rescue personnel and other emergency responders who might be traumatized by exposure to violent wildlife attacks. The recognition that secondary trauma could affect professional responders as well as direct victims represented an important advancement in emergency response protocols. The technological implications of Daniel's death included discussions about improved communication systems for recreational users in remote Arctic locations and enhanced tracking technologies that might allow rescue services to respond more quickly to emergency situations. However, the extreme remoteness of Daniel's fishing location meant that even perfect communication systems would not have allowed rescue personnel to reach him in time to prevent his death. The wildlife management implications of Daniel's death extended beyond Alaska to influence polar bear management policies throughout the Arctic. The case demonstrated that traditional approaches to managing human polar bear conflicts might be inadequate when dealing with bears facing extreme nutritional stress due to environmental changes. Research institutions throughout the Arctic began incorporating lessons learned from Bear 47's case into their studies of polar bear behavior and population dynamics. The detailed tracking data and behavioral observations from the incident provided valuable insights into how polar bears adapt their hunting strategies when faced with reduced prey availability. The conservation implications of Daniel's death were complex, as the incident highlighted the difficult balance between protecting endangered polar bears, bear populations, and ensuring human safety in Arctic environments. The death of Bear 47 during the recovery operation represented the loss of a mature breeding male from an already threatened population, while Daniel's death demonstrated the very real dangers posed by desperate polar bears to humans venturing into their habitat. Environmental organizations use Daniel's case to illustrate the broader impacts of climate change on Arctic ecosystems, arguing that changing environmental conditions were creating situations where human polar bear conflicts would become increasingly common. The case provided a compelling example of how environmental changes could have cascading effects that ultimately threatened both wildlife and human populations. The scientific value of Daniel's case extended beyond immediate wildlife management applications to contribute to broader understanding of predator-prey relationships in extreme environments. The detailed documentation of Bear 47's behavior provided researchers with rare insights into the decision-making processes of large predators facing life-threatening resource scarcity. Research papers based on various aspects of Daniel's case were published in journals specializing in wildlife biology, emergency medicine, forensic science, and Arctic studies. The multidisciplinary nature of the incident provided research opportunities for scientists from multiple fields, each of whom could extract different lessons from the comprehensive documentation of the attack and its aftermath. The memorial established for Daniel Kowalski took the form of a scholarship fund administered by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where Daniel had completed his associate degree in refrigeration technology. The Daniel M. Kowalski Memorial Scholarship provides annual financial assistance to students pursuing careers in technical trades, reflecting Daniel's belief in the value of skilled craftsmanship and practical education. The scholarship fund was established with initial contributions from Rebecca Kowalski, Daniel's family members, and the fundraising efforts organized by his friends and co-workers. The fund has provided educational assistance to over 30 students during the years since Daniel's death, ensuring that his memory continues to benefit others pursuing educational and career goals similar to his own. A second memorial to Daniel was established at the Milwaukee County Fishing Pier on Lake Michigan, where Daniel had spent countless hours fishing during his youth and had taught his nephews and neighborhood children the techniques and ethics of recreational angling. The memorial plaque recognizes Daniel's passion for fishing and his commitment to sharing that passion with younger generations. The scientific legacy of Daniel's death continues through ongoing research projects that utilize data and insights derived from the Bear 47 incident. Researchers from multiple institutions continue to analyze various aspects of the case, from polar bear behavioral ecology to emergency response protocols, ensuring that Daniel's death contributes to knowledge that may prevent similar tragedies in the future. The policy legacy of Daniel's death includes enhanced safety protocols for recreational activities in polar bear habitat and improved coordination between wildlife management agencies and emergency response services. The lessons learned from the incident have been incorporated into standard operating procedures for agencies throughout Alaska and other Arctic regions. The educational legacy of Daniel's death is perhaps the most significant aspect of his story's continuing impact, as the case continues to be used as a teaching tool in universities, training academies, and professional development programs throughout North America. The comprehensive documentation of the incident provides educators with realistic examples of how theoretical knowledge is applied in challenging real-world situations. The human legacy of Daniel's death lives on in the memories of those who knew him and in the ongoing efforts of his widow Rebecca to ensure that his story serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for others who share his passion for adventure and exploration. Rebecca has spoken at wilderness safety seminars and outdoor education programs, sharing Daniel's story while emphasizing the importance of proper safety preparation and risk assessment. The final chapter of Daniel's story continues to be written through the ongoing impacts of his death on polar bear research, Arctic safety protocols, and the lives of those who were touched by his passion for adventure and his dedication to pursuing experiences that challenged his physical and mental capabilities. His death in the Arctic wilderness of Alaska represents both a tragedy and a contribution to human understanding of the complex relationships between people and wildlife in some of Earth's most challenging environments. The enduring significance of Daniel Michael Kowalski's death on January 5, 2025, extends far beyond the tragic loss of a single life in the Arctic wilderness. His encounter with Bear 47 on the frozen expanse of the Chukchi Sea has become a defining case study in the complex relationship between human adventure seekers and apex predators in an environment where both species are struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Daniel's story serves as a stark reminder that the pursuit of solitude and challenge in Earth's most remote locations carries risks that cannot be eliminated through experience, preparation, or technology alone. The 6 minutes and 14 seconds that elapsed between Bear 47's first charge and Daniel's death represent a compressed lifetime of terror, courage, and ultimate human vulnerability in the face of nature's most perfectly adapted predator. His final radio transmission, captured forever in Coast Guard communication logs, stands as testimony to the human spirit's capacity to maintain clarity and concern for others, even in the face of certain death. Daniel's legacy lives on not only in the scholarship fund that bears his name, and the safety protocols that were developed in response to his death, but in the ongoing research that continues to extract knowledge from the tragedy that claimed his life. Every wilderness safety course that includes his case study, every polar bear researcher who references Bear 47's tracking data, and every family member who remembers his infectious enthusiasm for adventure, ensures that Daniel Michael Kowalski's presence continues to influence the world long after his voice fell silent on the ice of the Chukchi Sea. In the end, Daniel died as he had lived, pursuing the experiences that made him feel most alive, accepting risks that others considered unacceptable, and facing the ultimate challenge with the same determination that had characterized every other aspect of his 42 years on Earth. The next stories. Polar bear devours 68-year-old tourist in hotel parking lot, March 17, 2024. The Arctic wind howled across the tundra with a ferocity that seemed to carry the voices of ancient spirits, whipping snow into crystalline tornadoes that danced across the barren landscape surrounding Utqiagvik, Alaska. At 71 degrees north latitude, this remote Inupiat community perched on the edge of the world represented the northernmost settlement in the United States, a place where the sun disappeared for 65 days each winter and where the boundary between civilization and the primordial wilderness remained paper-thin. The Siku Arctic Circle Lodge, a modest two-story structure of reinforced timber and steel, stood as humanity's fragile outpost against the relentless Arctic elements, its amber windows glowing like beacons in the perpetual twilight of early March. Margaret Eleanor Stein adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and gazed through the frost-etched window of her second-floor room, marveling at the alien beauty of this landscape that seemed to exist at the very edge of existence itself. At 68 years old, the retired librarian from Duluth, Minnesota, had spent decades dreaming of this moment, saving every spare dollar from her modest pension to fund what she privately called her bucket list adventure. Her weathered hands, marked by years of turning pages and stamping due dates, now trembled slightly as she photographed the endless expanse of white that stretched toward the invisible Beaufort Sea. Margaret had always possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the comfortable confines of her Midwest existence. And the Arctic represented the ultimate frontier, a place where she could finally confront the raw power of nature in its most unforgiving form. The Siku Arctic Circle Lodge had been Margaret's home for the past 4 days, part of a carefully planned 8-day photography expedition designed to capture the northern lights during the optimal viewing season. The lodge itself represented a marvel of Arctic engineering, constructed with triple-pane windows, reinforced concrete foundations anchored deep into the permafrost, and a heating system capable of maintaining comfortable temperatures even when outside conditions plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The building's exterior featured weather-resistant cedar siding treated with specialized preservatives, while motion-activated floodlights illuminated a perimeter extending 50 yards in all directions, creating a protective bubble of artificial daylight around the structure. Lodge owner and operator Thomas Kanguk, a 45-year-old Inupiat businessman with deep roots in the community, had established the facility 12 years earlier with a combination of federal grants, private investment, and sheer determination to create economic opportunities in one of America's most isolated settlements. Thomas stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke to a lifetime of physical labor, his weathered face bearing the distinctive features of his indigenous heritage, and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to read the Arctic's subtle signs and moods. His great-grandfather had been a legendary whaling captain who could predict weather changes days in advance by observing the behavior of seabirds and the color of distant clouds, skills that Thomas had inherited, along with a profound respect for the delicate balance between human survival and natural forces. The lodge employed 8 full-time staff members during peak season, including Thomas's wife Sarah, a 42-year-old former nurse who served as general manager and handled guest relations with a combination of professional efficiency and genuine warmth. Sarah had grown up in Fairbanks before moving to Utqiagvik after meeting Thomas during his college years at the University of Alaska, and her medical background proved invaluable in a location where the nearest hospital lay over 300 miles away. Her auburn hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, framed a face marked by laugh lines and the kind of competent composure that made guests feel secure despite their remote location. David Ockpick, the lodge's head maintenance supervisor, was a 38-year-old engineering graduate who had returned to his ancestral home after a decade working in Anchorage's oil industry. His technical expertise with generators, heating systems, and communication equipment made him indispensable in an environment where mechanical failure could quickly become life-threatening. David's younger brother, Michael, 29, served as the primary guide for wildlife viewing expeditions. His encyclopedic knowledge of local fauna and migration patterns making him highly sought after by visiting photographers and researchers. The brothers shared their father's distinctive square jaw and their mother's quick wit, along with an intuitive understanding of Arctic conditions that came from childhood spent hunting and fishing on the tundra. The kitchen staff included Elena Vasquez, a 43-year-old chef from New Mexico who had answered Thomas's Craigslist ad 3 years earlier during a period of personal upheaval and never left. Finding peace in the Arctic's stark beauty and the challenge of creating gourmet meals with limited ingredients in extreme conditions. Elena's assistant, 19-year-old Katie Sovelik, was a local high school graduate who balanced her lodge duties with online college courses, her quick intelligence and natural leadership suggesting a bright future despite the limited opportunities available in such an isolated community. The remaining staff included James Murphy, a 54-year-old former Coast Guard helicopter pilot who served as the lodge's emergency coordinator and maintained crucial communications with outside authorities, and Patricia Wong, a 26-year-old graduate student in Arctic ecology who worked part-time while conducting research on climate change impacts in the region. James brought decades of search and rescue experience to his role, his military bearing and decisive manner providing reassurance to guests who sometimes struggled with the psychological impact of the Arctic's vastness and isolation. Patricia's academic background and youthful enthusiasm created an interesting dynamic, her scientific curiosity often leading to impromptu educational sessions that enhanced the guest experience. Margaret's fellow guests represented a diverse cross-section of adventure travelers drawn by the Arctic's unique attractions. Robert and Linda Harrison, a retired couple from Seattle, had spent their careers as commercial airline pilots and were now pursuing their shared passion for landscape photography with the methodical precision that had served them well in aviation. Robert, 71, possessed an engineer's mind for technical details and could discuss f-stops and shutter speeds with the same precision he once applied to flight planning, while Linda, 68, brought an artist's eye to composition and lighting that elevated their collaborative work beyond mere documentation. Dr. Amanda Foster, a 34-year-old emergency room physician from Chicago, had come to the Arctic as part of what she described as her extreme stress relief therapy, seeking experiences that would provide perspective on the life and death situations she faced daily in her urban hospital. Amanda's petite frame and delicate features belied an inner toughness forged by years of medical residency and emergency medicine practice, her quick reflexes and analytical mind making her an invaluable resource in crisis situations. She traveled alone, preferring the freedom to pursue her interests without the compromises required by group dynamics. The Yamamoto family, father Hiroshi, mother Keiko, and their 16-year-old son Takeshi, represented the lodge's most ambitious guests, having traveled from Osaka, Japan, to fulfill Hiroshi's lifelong dream of seeing the northern lights with his own eyes. Hiroshi, a 52-year-old automotive engineer, had meticulously planned every aspect of their trip with the same attention to detail he applied to designing transmission systems, while Keiko, a 49-year-old high school mathematics teacher, documented every moment with both traditional film cameras and digital equipment. Takeshi, initially reluctant to abandon his video games for a week in the Arctic wilderness, had gradually warmed to the adventure and now spent hours discussing wildlife biology with Patricia and learning traditional hunting techniques from Michael Ockpick. The final guest, Professor Edmund Blackwood, was a 62-year-old anthropologist from Oxford University who had come to Utqiagvik to conduct interviews with local elders about traditional ecological knowledge and climate change adaptation strategies. Edmund's tall, angular frame and perpetually disheveled appearance gave him the stereotypical look of an absent-minded professor, but his sharp intellect and genuine respect for indigenous wisdom had quickly earned him acceptance among community members who were often skeptical of outside researchers. The weather conditions during Margaret's visit had been relatively mild for mid-March, with daytime temperatures hovering around -10 degrees Fahrenheit and winds generally remaining below 20 miles per hour. The Arctic Ocean, visible as a dark line on the horizon, remained locked in ice that extended northward for hundreds of miles, creating a vast frozen highway that connected Alaska to the polar ice cap. This ice highway served as a crucial travel route for polar bears moving between hunting grounds, their massive paws perfectly adapted for navigating the shifting landscape of pressure ridges and open leads that characterize the dynamic Arctic sea ice environment. Polar bears, the Arctic's apex predator and largest land carnivore, had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to become perfectly adapted hunting machines capable of surviving in conditions that would quickly kill most other mammals. Adult males could weigh over 1,500 pounds and stand 11 feet tall on their hind legs, their powerful limbs and razor-sharp claws designed for killing seals through breathing holes in the sea ice. Their dense fur, which appeared white, but was actually composed of hollow, transparent guard hairs over a layer of dense underfur, provided insulation so effective that polar bears often overheated during physical exertion despite sub-zero temperatures. The bear's hunting strategy relied on patience and explosive power, with individuals capable of waiting motionlessly for hours beside seal breathing holes before delivering a killing blow with lightning speed. Their sense of smell was so acute they could detect seals beneath 3 feet of snow from over a mile away, while their swimming ability allowed them to cover vast distances between ice floes in search of prey. During summer months, when sea ice retreated beyond their hunting range, polar bears entered a state of walking hibernation called carnivore lethargy, surviving primarily on stored fat reserves while waiting for freeze-up to restore access to their marine hunting grounds. The relationship between Utqiagvik's human residents and the polar bear population that migrated through their territory represented a complex balance of respect, caution, and traditional knowledge passed down through generations of Inupiat hunters and elders. Community members understood that polar bears were not merely dangerous predators, but essential components of the Arctic ecosystem, worthy of respect and protection even as they posed constant threats to human safety. Traditional protocols for bear encounters emphasized avoidance rather than confrontation, with specific techniques for moving through bear country that minimized the risk of surprise encounters while respecting the bear's role as sacred beings in Inupiat cosmology. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game maintained detailed records of polar bear populations and movements throughout the Arctic regions, with biologists estimating that between 2,000 and 3,000 bears utilize the sea ice habitat accessible from Alaska's northern coast. Climate change had begun to significantly impact bear behavior patterns, with earlier ice breakup and later freeze-up dates forcing bears to spend longer periods on land where food sources were limited and conflicts with human communities became more likely. Research conducted over the past 2 decades indicated that polar bears were experiencing declining body condition and reduced reproductive success as their traditional hunting grounds became less reliable due to changing ice conditions. Margaret's fascination with polar bears had developed during childhood visits to the Como Park Zoo in St. Paul, where she would spend hours watching the bears swim in their artificial habitat while imagining the vast Arctic wilderness they represented. Her personal library contained dozens of books about polar bear biology, Arctic exploration, and climate change impacts on polar ecosystems, making her one of the most knowledgeable amateur naturalists among the lodge's guests. She had specifically requested a room with northern exposure so she could watch for bears moving across the sea ice, though Thomas had warned her that bear sightings from the lodge were relatively uncommon during March, when most bears were still actively hunting on the offshore ice. The lodge's location on the outskirts of Utqiagvik provided guests with immediate access to the tundra environment while maintaining convenient access to the community's limited amenities, including a small grocery store, health clinic, and cultural center. The building sat on a slight rise, approximately 1/4 mile from the nearest residential neighborhood, connected to the community by a gravel road that was maintained year-round, but could become impassable during severe weather events. Emergency services were provided by a volunteer fire department and a single police officer, with serious medical emergencies requiring evacuation to Fairbanks or Anchorage, depending on weather conditions and aircraft availability. Communication systems at the lodge included satellite internet with limited bandwidth, a satellite telephone system for emergency use, and traditional radio equipment capable of reaching Anchorage and other northern communities. The lodge's generator system provided primary electrical power supplemented by connection to the community's diesel-powered grid, with backup generators capable of maintaining essential systems during extended power outages. Fresh water came from a deep well, equipped with heating elements to prevent freezing, while waste management relied on a sophisticated septic system designed to function in permafrost conditions. Food service at the lodge represented one of Elena's greatest challenges and most impressive achievements, as she had learned to create varied and nutritious meals despite the logistical difficulties of obtaining fresh ingredients in such a remote location. Weekly supply flights brought frozen and shelf-stable ingredients from Anchorage, while local hunters occasionally provided fresh fish and game that added authentic Arctic flavors to the dining experience. Elena had developed relationships with community members who gathered traditional foods like cloudberries and Arctic char, creating a unique fusion cuisine that honored both local traditions and her guests' diverse culinary preferences. The lodge's daily routine typically began before dawn, with Elena preparing hearty breakfasts designed to fuel guests for long days of outdoor activities in extreme conditions. Margaret had quickly established herself as an early riser, often arriving in the dining room before 6 a.m. to enjoy coffee and conversation with staff members who appreciated her genuine interest in their lives and work. Her friendly demeanor and obvious respect for the local culture had earned her special consideration from Thomas and his team, who often shared stories and insights that were not typically offered to casual visitors. Margaret's photography equipment represented a significant investment in her Arctic dreams, including a professional-grade camera body with multiple lenses optimized for low-light conditions, a sturdy tripod capable of remaining stable in high winds, and specialized batteries designed to function in extreme cold. She had spent months learning the technical aspects of Northern Lights photography, practicing with star trail images in Minnesota's Northwoods, and studying the work of renowned Arctic photographers whose images had inspired her own journey. Her luggage also contained extensive cold weather gear, including a parka rated to -40 degrees, insulated boots, multiple layers of thermal underwear, and wind-resistant face protection. The cultural aspects of her Arctic experience had proven just as rewarding as the natural phenomena Margaret had come to witness, as community members gradually welcomed her into their daily lives and shared stories about traditional ways of life that were rapidly changing due to climate and cultural pressures. Eldemary Kanguk, Thomas's mother, had spent several evenings teaching Margaret traditional Inupiat words for ice conditions and weather patterns, knowledge that had been essential for survival in the Arctic for countless generations, but was now at risk of being lost as younger community members adopted modern lifestyles and technologies. The scientific research being conducted by Patricia Wong had added another dimension to Margaret's understanding of the Arctic environment, as the young graduate student explained the complex interactions between sea ice, polar bear populations, and climate change that were reshaping the entire Arctic ecosystem. Patricia's research focused on documenting changes in vegetation patterns and wildlife populations that served as indicators of broader environmental shifts, data that would contribute to policy decisions about Arctic conservation and indigenous land rights that would affect communities like Utqiagvik for generations to come. Weather forecasting in the Arctic represented both an art and a science, combining sophisticated satellite data and computer models with traditional knowledge accumulated over generations of living in intimate contact with natural forces. Thomas consulted multiple sources daily, including National Weather Service forecasts from Fairbanks, military weather reports from nearby radar installations, and the informal network of hunters and travelers who shared real-time conditions via radio and satellite phone communications. The accuracy of these forecasts often meant the difference between safe travel and life-threatening exposure, making weather assessment a crucial skill for anyone operating in the Arctic environment. March 17, 2024, began with what meteorologists classified as typical Arctic spring conditions, with clear skies, temperatures around -12 degrees Fahrenheit, and light winds from the northeast. The barometric pressure remained stable, suggesting that the current weather pattern would persist for at least the next 24 hours, providing ideal conditions for the Northern Lights photography session that Margaret and her fellow guests had been anticipating for days. The aurora forecast indicated moderate geomagnetic activity, with a high probability of visible displays beginning around 10 p.m. local time, news that generated considerable excitement among the photographers who had traveled thousands of miles for such an opportunity. Margaret spent the morning reviewing her camera settings and testing equipment in the lodge's heated workshop area, where David Ockpick had set up a makeshift photography studio complete with work tables, electrical outlets, and storage areas for the guests' valuable equipment. The workshop served multiple purposes, functioning as a repair facility for the lodge's mechanical systems, while also providing a space where guests could maintain their gear and seek technical advice from staff members who had learned to adapt modern technology to Arctic conditions through years of practical experience. The afternoon brought an unexpected treat, as Michael Ockpick announced that he had spotted a group of snowy owls hunting on the tundra approximately 2 miles from the lodge, providing an excellent opportunity for wildlife photography before the evening's aurora session. The owls, magnificent Arctic raptors with wingspans exceeding 5 feet, had arrived in unusually large numbers due to an abundance of lemming prey, creating what Michael described as a once-in-a-decade viewing opportunity that coincided perfectly with the guests' visit. Margaret joined Robert and Linda Harrison, Dr. Amanda Foster, and Professor Blackwood for the owl photography expedition, bundling into the lodge's heated all-terrain vehicle for the journey across the frozen tundra. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, an undulating carpet of white, punctuated by occasional willows, and the geometric patterns created by ice wedge polygons that formed when permafrost expanded and contracted through seasonal temperature cycles. The subtle beauty of this seemingly barren environment revealed itself gradually to observant visitors, from the delicate crystals that formed on exposed vegetation to the complex interplay of light and shadow that changed constantly as the low Arctic sun tracked across the southern horizon. The snowy owls proved to be cooperative subjects, their confidence in their Arctic domain allowing the photographers to approach within reasonable distances while the birds continued their methodical hunting behavior. Margaret captured dozens of images, marveling at the owl's ability to locate prey beneath the snow through hearing alone, their asymmetrical ear openings providing the precise directional information needed to pinpoint mouse and lemming movements invisible to human senses. The owl's patient hunting style reminded her of the polar bears she hoped to eventually photograph, predators that had evolved similar patience and precision in environments where energy conservation was crucial for survival. The expedition returned to the lodge as the brief Arctic day began its transition to the prolonged twilight that preceded true darkness, the western horizon displaying subtle gradations of orange and pink that contrasted beautifully with the deep blue of the approaching night. Margaret felt energized by the successful photography session and the prospect of capturing Northern Lights images that would serve as the crown jewel of her Arctic adventure, fulfilling dreams she had harbored for decades while creating memories that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead in her later years. Dinner that evening featured Elena's signature Arctic char, prepared with local cloudberries and wild rice, accompanied by freshly baked bread and a selection of wines that had been carefully transported to the lodge despite the logistical challenges involved in shipping alcohol to remote Arctic communities. The meal provided an opportunity for guests to share stories from their day's adventures while building the social connections that often proved just as memorable as the natural phenomena they had come to witness. Margaret found herself seated between Professor Blackwood and young Takeshi Yamamoto, a seating arrangement that led to a fascinating three-way conversation about Arctic ecology, traditional knowledge systems, and the importance of preserving indigenous cultures in an increasingly globalized world. Professor Blackwood's anthropological insights complemented Margaret's naturalist observations, while Takeshi's fresh perspective and thoughtful questions added energy to discussions that might otherwise have become overly academic. The conversation gradually shifted to polar bears as Patricia Wong shared recent research findings about changing bear behavior patterns and their implications for both wildlife conservation and human safety in Arctic communities. She explained how climate change was forcing bears to spend longer periods on land, increasing the probability of encounters with humans while simultaneously reducing the bears' access to their primary food sources on the sea ice. This combination of factors created what researchers termed a perfect storm of conditions that were likely to make bear-human conflicts more frequent and more dangerous in coming decades. Thomas Kanguk contributed traditional Inupiat perspectives on polar bear behavior, describing how his grandfather and other elders had developed sophisticated techniques for coexisting with bears that included specific protocols for food storage, waste management, and travel routes that minimize the risk of dangerous encounters. These traditional practices were based on generations of careful observation and hard-won experience, representing a knowledge system that complemented but sometimes contradicted the findings of modern wildlife biology research. The discussion proved particularly relevant as Michael Ockpick reported fresh polar bear tracks discovered earlier that day approximately 3 miles east of the lodge, evidence that at least one bear was moving through the area despite the relatively early date in the spring migration season. The tracks appeared to belong to a large adult, possibly a male bear beginning to move inland after months of hunting on the offshore sea ice. Such early inland movements were becoming more common as climate change disrupted traditional seasonal patterns, forcing bears to adapt their behavior in ways that were not yet fully understood by researchers. Thomas emphasized that the presence of bear tracks in the vicinity did not pose an immediate threat to lodge guests, as the facility's security measures had been designed specifically to prevent bear encounters and had proven effective throughout 12 years of operation. These measures included motion-activated floodlights, secure food storage systems, and staff protocols that ensured human activities remained safely contained within the lodge's protected perimeter. Nevertheless, he reminded guests to remain vigilant during any outdoor activities and to immediately report any bear sightings to lodge personnel. The Northern Lights photography session was scheduled to begin at 9:30 p.m., when astronomical twilight would provide the optimal balance of darkness for aurora visibility and residual light for foreground detail in landscape compositions. Margaret spent the intervening time organizing her equipment and reviewing the technical settings that would be required for aurora photography, including the high ISO settings, wide apertures, and extended exposure times necessary to capture the ethereal displays of light that occurred when charged particles from the sun interacted with Earth's magnetic field high in the atmosphere. The aurora forecast indicated strong geomagnetic activity beginning around 10 p.m., with the possibility of spectacular displays extending well into the early morning hours. Such conditions were ideal for photography, but occurred relatively infrequently, making this evening particularly special for guests who might not have another opportunity to witness such phenomena during their Arctic visit. The lodge's location, far from any significant light pollution, provided perfect conditions for aurora viewing, with the northern horizon completely unobstructed and dark skies that allowed even subtle auroral activity to be clearly visible. At 9:15 p.m., Thomas made an announcement that the aurora photography session would begin in 15 minutes, encouraging guests to begin their final equipment preparations and dress in their warmest clothing for what could be several hours of outdoor exposure in sub-zero temperatures. The lodge's heated mudroom provided space for guests to organize their gear and make last-minute adjustments to camera settings before venturing into the Arctic night. Margaret felt a familiar excitement building as she pulled on her insulated boots and checked her camera bag one final time, ensuring that backup batteries and memory cards were easily accessible despite the bulky gloves she would need to wear for protection against the cold. She had practiced these equipment management techniques extensively during winter photography sessions in Minnesota, but the Arctic conditions represented a new level of challenge that would test both her technical skills and her ability to remain comfortable during extended periods of outdoor exposure. The group of photographers assembled in the lodge's main entrance at 9:30 p.m. sharp, their equipment cases and tripods creating a small mountain of gear that would need to be transported to the optimal viewing location approximately 100 yards north of the lodge building. Thomas and Michael Ockpick would accompany the group to provide assistance with equipment setup and serve as safety monitors during the photography session. Their familiarity with local conditions and wildlife protocols, providing additional security for guests who were operating in an unfamiliar and potentially dangerous environment. The temperature outside registered -14 degrees Fahrenheit with winds of approximately 8 miles per hour from the northeast. Conditions that Thomas characterized as ideal for aurora photography since the cold, stable air would minimize atmospheric turbulence that could blur photographic images. The moon, nearly full, provided enough illumination to make navigation safe, while remaining dim enough not to interfere with aurora visibility, creating what experienced aurora photographers considered perfect conditions for capturing high-quality images. Margaret followed the group across the snow-covered ground toward the designated photography area, her boots crunching softly in the dry snow while her breath created small clouds of vapor that dispersed quickly in the cold air. The silence of the Arctic night was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of the photographer's footsteps and the distant hum of the lodge's generator system. Above them, the stars shone with an intensity rarely visible in more populated regions, their light undiminished by atmospheric pollution or artificial illumination. The photography area had been selected to provide optimal northern exposure while maintaining reasonable proximity to the lodge for safety and convenience. Several wooden platforms built by David Ockpick provided stable surfaces for tripod setup, while small windbreaks constructed from local materials offered some protection from the prevailing winds without obstructing the photographer's views of the northern horizon, where aurora displays typically appeared first. As the photographers began setting up their equipment, Thomas conducted a brief safety briefing that emphasized the importance of staying within the designated photography area and immediately reporting any unusual sounds or movements that might indicate wildlife presence. He reminded the group that polar bears were primarily nocturnal hunters who moved silently across snow and could approach human settlements without warning, making constant vigilance essential even within the supposedly secure perimeter around the lodge. Margaret positioned her tripod on one of the wooden platforms and began the careful process of setting up her camera for aurora photography, adjusting the legs for perfect stability and mounting her widest lens to capture as much of the sky as possible in each frame. Her camera settings had been predetermined through extensive research and practice. ISO 1600, aperture f/2.8, and exposure times between 10 and 30 seconds depending on the brightness and movement of any aurora displays that might develop. The first hint of aurora activity appeared at 9:47 p.m. as a faint green glow along the northern horizon, barely visible to the naked eye, but clearly detectable through the camera's viewfinder when Margaret aimed her lens toward the area of activity. The display gradually intensified over the following minutes, developing into distinct curtains of light that danced and shifted across the sky in patterns that seemed to follow some cosmic choreography invisible to human observers. Margaret began capturing images at 30-second intervals, each exposure revealing details and colors that were not immediately apparent to her eyes, but which the camera's sensor recorded with stunning clarity. The aurora's green base color, created by oxygen atoms excited at altitudes between 60 and 150 miles above Earth's surface, was complemented by subtle hints of red and purple that appeared when the solar particles penetrated to different atmospheric layers, where other gases contributed their own spectral signatures to the display. The other photographers worked with similar intensity, their cameras clicking at regular intervals as they documented what was developing into one of the most spectacular aurora displays any of them had ever witnessed. Professor Blackwood abandoned his camera after capturing a few reference shots and simply stood watching the sky, his academic composure giving way to the wonder that such displays had inspired in human observers for millennia before the scientific explanations for aurora became understood. The display continued to intensify through 10:30 p.m., with individual aurora curtains extending from the northern horizon nearly to the zenith directly overhead, their movements becoming increasingly dynamic as the geomagnetic storm responsible for the activity reached peak intensity. Margaret found herself torn between the technical demands of photography and the simple desire to experience the phenomenon directly, without the mediation of camera equipment that could capture the visual spectacle, but could never convey the profound sense of connection to cosmic forces that such displays inspired. At 10:47 p.m., the aurora reached a level of intensity that Thomas described as extraordinary, even by Arctic standards, with brilliant green curtains writhing across the entire northern half of the sky, while rare red colorations appeared at higher altitudes, creating a display that would be visible even from locations with significant light pollution hundreds of miles to the south. Margaret's camera captured frame after frame of the spectacular light show, each image representing a moment in a celestial performance that would never be exactly repeated, despite the millions of similar displays that had occurred throughout Earth's history. The group's attention was so completely focused on the aurora display overhead that none of them noticed the large white shape moving slowly across the tundra approximately 400 yards to the east, its massive form blending seamlessly with the snow-covered landscape as it investigated the unfamiliar scents and sounds emanating from the human settlement. The polar bear, an adult male weighing approximately 1,300 pounds, had been traveling inland for 3 days after the sea ice hunting area, where he normally spent March, had become unstable due to an unexpected warming period that created dangerous conditions for a bear of his size. The bear's acute sense of smell had detected the lodge's presence from over 2 miles away, drawing him toward the concentration of unfamiliar odors that suggested possible food sources or territorial threats requiring investigation. His approach was methodical and cautious, utilizing natural windbreaks and terrain features to remain concealed while gathering information about the human activity that represented both opportunity and danger in his simplified predator's worldview. At 11:15 p.m., as the aurora display began to diminish slightly from its earlier peak intensity, Michael Ockpick detected an unusual scent carried on the northeast wind, a musky, oily odor that experienced Arctic residents immediately recognized as indicating polar bear presence in the immediate vicinity. He quietly alerted Thomas, who began scanning the surrounding area with night vision binoculars, while Michael started the process of gathering the photography group for immediate return to the lodge. Thomas's binoculars revealed the bear's location approximately 200 yards east of the photography area, close enough that an immediate retreat to the lodge was necessary, but far enough away that a careful, organized withdrawal could be accomplished without triggering the bear's prey drive through sudden movements or sounds. He whispered instructions to Michael, who began quietly informing each photographer that the session needed to end immediately due to wildlife presence, emphasizing the importance of moving slowly and avoiding any actions that might attract unwanted attention. Margaret was in the process of reviewing her most recent images on her camera's LCD screen when Michael approached her position, his urgent but controlled demeanor immediately conveying the seriousness of the situation without creating panic that could complicate their safe withdrawal. She quickly secured her camera and began the process of breaking down her tripod, her movements automatic after years of photography experience, despite the adrenaline surge that accompanied her realization that they were sharing the Arctic night with one of the world's most powerful predators. The photographers gathered their equipment with remarkable efficiency, considering the circumstances, their earlier safety briefing, and natural caution, combining to produce an organized retreat that maintained the calm, deliberate pace that Thomas knew was essential for avoiding aggressive responses from the bear that continued to monitor their activity from its position on the tundra. The bear's behavior suggested curiosity rather than immediate hunting intent. But Thomas understood that polar bear behavior could change rapidly and unpredictably, particularly when bears were hungry or felt cornered by human presence. The group's movement toward the lodge proceeded smoothly until Dr. Amanda Foster, who was carrying both her camera equipment and Professor Blackwood's heavier tripod, stumbled slightly on a patch of uneven snow and dropped the tripod with a metallic crash that echoed clearly across the silent tundra. The sudden noise immediately attracted the bear's attention, causing him to raise his massive head and focus intently on the group of humans who had suddenly become much more interesting than they had been during their previous period of quiet activity. Thomas observed the bear's reaction through his binoculars and noted the subtle shift in posture that indicated increased alertness and possible preparation for more aggressive investigation of the disturbance. The bear began moving toward their position, not at the full charge speed that would indicate an immediate attack, but at the steady, purposeful pace that polar bears used when investigating potential threats or opportunities. Thomas estimated that the bear would reach their position in approximately 3 minutes if he maintained his current speed and direction, timing that would allow the group to reach the lodge's entrance, but would provide little margin for error or additional delays. Michael Ockpick took charge of the equipment that Dr. Foster had dropped, slinging the tripod over his shoulder while gesturing for the group to continue their movement toward the lodge, at a slightly increased pace that remained steady and controlled, despite the obvious urgency of their situation. His experience with polar bear encounters during hunting and guiding activities provided him with the knowledge necessary to balance speed with safety, understanding that panic or rapid movements were more likely to trigger aggressive bear behavior than the measured withdrawal they were currently executing. Margaret found herself positioned in the middle of the group as they approached the lodge, her heart rate elevated by the excitement of the close encounter, but her movements remaining controlled and deliberate as she followed Thomas's whispered instructions for safe withdrawal procedures. She could see the lodge's brightly lit entrance approximately 50 yards ahead, a beacon of safety that seemed simultaneously very close and impossibly far away given their current circumstances and the knowledge that a massive predator was approaching their position from behind. The bear's investigation brought him to within 100 yards of the retreating group, close enough that his massive size and predatory grace became clearly visible even in the limited moonlight that illuminated the scene. Margaret caught a glimpse of the magnificent animal over her shoulder and felt a complex mixture of fear and awe at encountering such a perfect example of evolutionary adaptation in its natural environment, a creature whose ancestors had ruled the Arctic for hundreds of thousands of years, and whose presence represented a direct connection to the primordial forces that had shaped this landscape since the last ice age. Thomas reached the lodge's entrance first and immediately began the process of opening the reinforced steel door while scanning the area behind the group to monitor the bear's continued approach. The lodge's motion-activated floodlights had triggered when the group came within range, bathing the immediate area in bright white light that provided clear visibility but also created a stark contrast with the darkness beyond the illuminated perimeter, where the bear continued his investigation. Michael Ockpick ushered the photographers through the lodge entrance with professional efficiency, ensuring that each person entered safely while maintaining his own position as the last barrier between the guests and any potential danger. His calm demeanor and obvious competence provided reassurance to the group members who were experiencing their first close encounter with Arctic wildlife, demonstrating the kind of leadership that was essential for safe operations in environments where survival often depended on making correct decisions under pressure. The last member of the photography group, Professor Blackwood, entered the lodge at 11:28 p.m., followed immediately by Michael, who secured the heavy door behind them and activated the additional locking mechanisms that were designed to prevent wildlife intrusion. The lodge's security systems included reinforced doors and windows, motion sensors that provided early warning of approaching animals, and communication equipment that could summon assistance from community emergency responders if situations developed beyond the capability of lodge staff to manage independently. Inside the lodge's warm, well-lit interior, the photographers began the process of decompressing from their encounter while securing their valuable equipment and sharing excited observations about both the spectacular aurora display and their close encounter with one of the Arctic's most iconic predators. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she reviewed the images she had captured during the evening, the technical quality of her aurora photographs contrasting with the immediate reality of having shared the Arctic landscape with a creature capable of killing and consuming a human being within minutes if circumstances had developed differently. Thomas and Michael maintained their professional vigilance despite the group's safe return to the lodge, continuing to monitor the bear's location and behavior through the facility's window systems and external cameras. The bear had approached to within 30 yards of the lodge entrance before stopping to investigate the various scents and visual cues associated with human habitation, his massive form clearly visible under the bright floodlights as he tested the air with his sensitive nose and evaluated this unusual concentration of foreign elements in his Arctic domain. The polar bear's investigation of the lodge perimeter represented normal behavior for a curious predator encountering unfamiliar territory. But Thomas understood that the situation could change rapidly if the bear detected specific odors or visual cues that triggered hunting behaviors. Food sense, in particular, could transform a merely curious bear into an aggressive predator determined to access whatever resources might be available within the human structure, making continued vigilance essential until the bear moved away from the immediate vicinity. Elena Vasquez had prepared hot chocolate and coffee for the returning photographers, providing welcome warmth and comfort after their extended exposure to sub-zero temperatures during the aurora photography session. The warm beverages also served a practical purpose by helping to prevent hypothermia and frostbite that could develop if the group members did not properly rewarm their core body temperatures after hours of outdoor activity in extreme cold. Margaret accepted a steaming mug of hot chocolate and positioned herself near one of the lodge's northern windows, hoping to continue observing the magnificent bear that was still investigating the area immediately outside the building. The floodlights provided excellent visibility, allowing her to study the bear's massive proportions and fluid movements as he systematically explored the unfamiliar environment using senses that were far more acute than anything humans possessed. The bear's investigation continued for nearly 40 minutes, during which he circled the lodge's perimeter twice, while paying particular attention to areas where food preparation and waste management activities had left distinctive scent markers that attracted his interest. His behavior remained investigative rather than aggressive, suggesting that he had not yet identified the lodge as either a threat requiring defensive action or a resource worth obtaining through more forceful methods. At 12:17 a.m. on March 18th, the bear appeared to lose interest in the lodge and began moving westward across the tundra toward the community of Utqiagvik proper, his departure providing visible relief to the lodge staff who had maintained their emergency preparedness throughout his visit. Thomas and Michael continued monitoring his movement until he disappeared from view approximately 1 mile from the lodge, far enough away that he no longer posed an immediate threat to the facility or its occupants. The excitement of the evening's events created an atmosphere of shared adventure among the lodge guests, who spent the following hour reviewing photographs, comparing observations, and discussing the implications of climate change for polar bear populations and human communities throughout the Arctic region. Margaret found herself at the center of many conversations, her obvious knowledge of polar bear biology and behavior making her a valuable resource for other guests who were less familiar with Arctic wildlife. Dr. Amanda Foster's medical background led to an interesting discussion about the physiological adaptations that allowed polar bears to survive in extreme cold while maintaining their ability to generate the explosive bursts of speed and power necessary for successful hunting. The conversation covered topics ranging from the bear's specialized circulatory systems that prevented heat loss through their extremities to metabolize fat reserves during extended periods without access to food sources. Professor Blackwood contributed anthropological perspectives on the cultural significance of polar bears in indigenous Arctic societies, explaining how traditional Inupiat hunting practices and spiritual beliefs reflected sophisticated understanding of bear behavior and ecology that had been developed through thousands of years of coexistence. His research into traditional knowledge systems had revealed hunting techniques and safety protocols that often proved more effective than modern wildlife management strategies in preventing dangerous encounters while maintaining sustainable relationships between human communities and bear populations. The Yamamoto family's experience provided an interesting cultural perspective on the evening's events, as their Japanese background had not prepared them for such direct encounters with large predators, despite Hiroshi's careful preparation for their Arctic adventure. Takeshi, in particular, seemed energized by the experience and peppered Michael Ockpick with questions about polar bear behavior, hunting techniques, and traditional methods for avoiding dangerous encounters during travel across bear habitat. As the group gradually dispersed to their rooms around 1:30 a.m., Margaret lingered in the common area to complete her review of the evening's photographs and record detailed notes about both the aurora display and the polar bear encounter in the journal she had maintained throughout her Arctic adventure. Her images captured not only the spectacular celestial light show, but also several frames that showed the bear's massive silhouette against the snow-covered landscape, creating a visual record of an experience that would remain vivid in her memory for the remainder of her life. The following morning brought clear skies and relatively warm temperatures around -8 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that Thomas described as ideal for the dog sledding expedition that was scheduled as the day's primary activity. The traditional Alaskan dog sled teams maintained by community members provided guests with opportunities to experience the transportation methods that had enabled human survival in the Arctic for thousands of years before the introduction of modern mechanical alternatives. Margaret had been particularly looking forward to the dog sledding experience, as her research into Arctic history had given her deep appreciation for the partnership between humans and sled dogs that had made exploration and survival possible in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The dogs themselves represented specialized breeds that had been developed specifically for Arctic conditions. Their thick coats, efficient metabolisms, and natural enthusiasm for running in cold weather, making them ideally suited for their traditional roles as transportation providers and hunting partners. The dog sled operation was managed by Samuel Kanguk, Thomas's uncle, and a traditional musher who had been training and racing sled dogs for over 30 years. Samuel's team consisted of 12 Alaskan Huskies whose bloodlines traced back to dogs used by early Arctic explorers and indigenous hunters, animals whose genetic heritage represented thousands of years of natural selection for the specific traits necessary for survival and productivity in Arctic conditions. Margaret's enthusiasm for the dog sledding experience was evident as she helped Samuel prepare the team for their morning run. Her questions about dog training techniques and traditional mushing methods, demonstrating her genuine interest in learning about Arctic traditions rather than simply consuming them as tourist entertainment. Samuel appreciated her respectful approach and took extra time to explain the complex relationships between mushers and their dogs that made successful Arctic travel possible. The morning's dog sledding route followed traditional hunting trails that extended approximately 15 miles across the tundra toward the sea ice margin, providing guests with opportunities to observe Arctic wildlife and experience the unique sensation of traveling across snow-covered wilderness using methods that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The dogs' obvious enjoyment of their work added an element of joy to the experience that complemented the practical education about traditional transportation methods. Margaret's position in the sled provided excellent opportunities for photography as the team crossed varied terrain that included frozen ponds, willow thickets, and open tundra, where the subtle beauty of the Arctic landscape revealed itself through careful observation. Her images captured not only the scenic elements of their journey, but also the working relationship between Samuel and his dogs, documenting traditional knowledge and skills that were becoming increasingly rare as modern technology replaced historical practices. The dog team's route passed within 2 miles of the location where the polar bear had been observed the previous evening, though no fresh tracks or other signs indicated that he remained in the immediate area. Samuel's experienced eye read the landscape for subtle indicators of wildlife presence, his knowledge of animal behavior patterns allowing him to interpret tracks, scat, and other signs that revealed which species had passed through specific areas and when their activity had occurred. During a rest stop approximately 8 miles from the lodge, Samuel shared traditional stories about polar bear encounters that had occurred during his decades of travel across the Arctic landscape, tales that emphasized both the magnificent power of these predators and the respect that successful Arctic travelers maintained for animals whose territorial claims preceded human presence by hundreds of thousands of years. His stories provided context for the previous evening's encounter while reinforcing the importance of maintaining appropriate caution and respect when sharing the landscape with such formidable predators. The return journey to the lodge provided additional opportunities for wildlife observation as the team encountered a small herd of caribou moving across the tundra approximately 1 mile to the south. the animals' graceful movement across the snow-covered landscape, creating a scene that seemed unchanged from the prehistoric periods when similar herds had provided sustenance for the first human inhabitants of the Arctic region. Margaret's photographs of the caribou added another dimension to her visual documentation of Arctic wildlife diversity. The dog sledding expedition returned to the lodge at 2:30 p.m., with Margaret and her fellow guests energized by their experience and full of questions about traditional Arctic lifestyles and the challenges facing indigenous communities as climate change and modernization altered the environmental and cultural foundations of their traditional ways of life. The afternoon provided opportunities for guests to warm up, organize their photographs, and participate in cultural presentations by community elders who shared traditional knowledge about Arctic survival techniques and indigenous worldviews. Elder Mary Kanguk's presentation focused on traditional women's roles in Arctic survival, including clothing production, food preparation and preservation, and child-rearing practices that had enabled indigenous communities to thrive in extreme environments for thousands of years before contact with European cultures introduced new technologies and social systems. Her demonstration of traditional skin sewing techniques provided insights into the sophisticated understanding of materials and construction methods that had been necessary for creating clothing capable of protecting human life in Arctic conditions. Margaret's participation in the cultural presentations reflected her genuine interest in learning about indigenous perspectives on Arctic environments and wildlife, her questions demonstrating respect for traditional knowledge systems, while seeking to understand how indigenous worldviews differed from the scientific approaches she was more familiar with through her extensive reading about Arctic ecology and climate change. The elders appreciated her respectful approach and gradually shared increasingly detailed information about traditional practices that were not typically discussed with casual visitors. The afternoon's activities concluded with a presentation by Patricia Wong about her climate change research, which provided scientific context for many of the traditional observations that community elders had shared about changing environmental conditions in the Arctic region. Patricia's data on temperature trends, ice conditions, and wildlife population changes corroborated indigenous knowledge about environmental shifts that had been occurring over the past several decades, creating an interesting dialogue between traditional and scientific ways of understanding environmental change. Dinner that evening featured traditional Arctic foods, including seal meat provided by local hunters, bannock bread baked according to recipes that had sustained Arctic travelers for generations, and locally gathered cloudberries that added sweetness and essential vitamins to the meal. Elena had worked with community members to prepare the traditional foods using authentic methods, while ensuring that the meal would be appealing to guests who might not be familiar with indigenous Arctic cuisine. Margaret found the traditional meal fascinating both from culinary and cultural perspectives, her questions about food preparation and preservation techniques leading to detailed discussions about the sophisticated understanding of nutrition and resource management that had enabled indigenous Arctic communities to maintain healthy populations despite the limited diversity of locally available food sources. The meal provided insights into traditional knowledge systems that complemented her scientific understanding of Arctic ecosystems. The evening's Northern Lights forecast indicated continued geomagnetic activity with good possibilities for aurora displays, though the intensity was expected to be somewhat lower than the spectacular show that had been witnessed the previous night. Margaret and several other guests expressed interest in another photography session, though Thomas emphasized that any outdoor activities would need to be carefully monitored given the previous night's polar bear encounter and the possibility that the same animal or others might be in the vicinity. Preparations for the second night's aurora photography session included additional safety measures based on the previous evening's experience. with Michael Ockpick conducting a more detailed reconnaissance of the surrounding area before guests would be allowed to set up their equipment. The lodge's emergency protocols had also been reviewed and refined to ensure that any future wildlife encounters could be managed with maximum safety and minimum disruption to both guests and the animals involved. At 8:45 p.m., Michael completed his security assessment of the photography area and reported no signs of recent bear activity, though he emphasized that polar bears could appear without warning and that all participants needed to remain alert for any signs of wildlife presence throughout the evening's activities. The aurora forecast had been upgraded slightly, with predictions of moderate to strong activity beginning around 10:30 p.m. and continuing into the early morning hours. Margaret's preparation for the second night's photography session was more efficient than her initial setup, her experience from the previous evening having taught her optimal techniques for managing equipment in extreme cold while maintaining the flexibility needed for quick adjustments to camera settings as aurora conditions changed. Her confidence in her technical abilities allowed her to focus more attention on the artistic aspects of aurora photography while remaining alert for any safety issues that might develop. The photography group assembled at 9:30 p.m. with equipment that had been pre-configured based on the previous night's successful settings, reducing setup time and allowing more focus on safety monitoring and artistic composition. The clear skies and stable weather conditions provided ideal circumstances for aurora photography, with minimal wind and excellent atmospheric transparency that would allow even subtle aurora displays to be clearly visible and photographable. Margaret positioned herself at the same location she had used successfully the previous evening. Her familiarity with the specific viewpoints and foreground elements available from that position providing advantages for composition while allowing her to work more efficiently in the challenging conditions. Her tripod setup was completed quickly and her camera settings verified before the scheduled start time, leaving her free to assist other photographers and participate in the social aspects of the group activity. The first aurora activity appeared at 9:52 p.m. as a faint green arch along the northern horizon, similar to the initial development from the previous evening, but with slightly less intensity based on the brightness visible to naked eye observation. Margaret began her photography sequence immediately, capturing baseline images that would document the aurora's development, even if the display did not reach the spectacular levels achieved during the previous night's session. Thomas and Michael maintained their security monitoring positions while allowing the photographers freedom to work without unnecessary restrictions, their experience from the previous evening having demonstrated that wildlife encounters could be managed successfully through proper preparation and rapid response procedures. The lodge's floodlight system provided security illumination while remaining dim enough not to interfere with aurora photography, creating optimal conditions for both safety and artistic achievement. The aurora display gradually intensified over the following 30 minutes, developing into the characteristic curtain formations that experienced aurora watchers recognized as indicators of strengthening geomagnetic activity. Margaret's photography captured the subtle evolution of colors and patterns as the display grew more dynamic, her technical skills allowing her to document phenomena that would have been impossible to record using earlier generation camera technology. At 10:47 p.m., the aurora reached peak intensity for the evening, with bright green curtains extending across approximately 60% of the northern sky, creating spectacular displays that rivaled the previous night's activity, even if they did not quite achieve the same extraordinary levels of brightness and coverage. Margaret's photographs from this period would later be recognized as among the finest amateur aurora images captured during the 2024 Northern Lights season. The photography session continued successfully until 11:35 p.m., when Michael Ockpick detected fresh polar bear tracks in snow approximately 150 yards southeast of the photography location. The tracks appeared to have been made within the previous hour based on their sharpness and lack of wind erosion, indicating that a bear had passed through the area during the current photography session without being detected by the human participants. Thomas's examination of the tracks through night vision binoculars revealed that they belonged to a large, adult bear, possibly the same individual that had investigated the lodge the previous evening, though definitive identification was not possible based solely on track evidence. The tracks indicated that the bear had been moving westward toward the community, following a route that would have brought him within 50 yards of the photography group without their knowledge. The discovery of fresh tracks prompted an immediate but orderly conclusion to the evening's photography session, with equipment being secured rapidly, but without the panic that might have accompanied the realization that a polar bear had been in close proximity throughout much of their outdoor activity. Thomas's leadership during the withdrawal to the lodge demonstrated the kind of calm competence that was essential for safe operations in environments where wildlife encounters were always possible despite preventive measures. Margaret's reaction to learning about the bear's proximity during their photography session was complex, combining concern for the safety implications with excitement about sharing the Arctic landscape with such magnificent predators. Her photographs from the evening would gain additional significance, knowing that they had been captured while a polar bear moved silently through the darkness nearby, creating documentation of a moment when human artistic expression and wild predatory behavior had briefly coexisted in the same Arctic space. The group's return to the lodge's safety was accomplished without incident, though Thomas and Michael maintained heightened security monitoring throughout the remainder of the evening to ensure that no bears approached the lodge building itself. The facility's security systems functioned properly, providing early warning capabilities that would alert staff to any wildlife presence near the building perimeter throughout the night hours when visibility was limited and guest vigilance was reduced. Inside the lodge, the evening's photography session was reviewed with enthusiasm, despite the security concerns that had prompted its early conclusion, with guests sharing images and discussing techniques while appreciating both their artistic achievements and their good fortune in avoiding any direct encounters with the polar bear whose presence had been detected through tracking evidence. Margaret's images were particularly well received, demonstrating technical excellence and artistic vision that elevated them beyond mere documentation of natural phenomena. Dr. Amanda Foster's medical training led to an interesting discussion about polar bear attack injuries and emergency medical procedures that would be necessary in such remote locations where advanced trauma care was not immediately available. Her knowledge of wilderness medicine provided sobering context for the evening's discoveries, while reinforcing the importance of the safety protocols that Thomas and his staff had implemented to prevent such encounters from occurring. Professor Blackwood contributed historical perspectives on polar bear attacks documented in Arctic exploration literature, sharing accounts of encounters that had occurred during early expeditions when safety equipment and emergency communication systems were not available. His stories emphasized both the deadly serious nature of polar bear encounters and the remarkable survival skills that had enabled some attack victims to recover despite severe injuries and limited medical resources. The conversation gradually evolved into broader discussions about climate change impacts on polar bear behavior and the increasing frequency of bear-human encounters that were being documented throughout Arctic regions as changing ice conditions forced bears to spend more time on land, where conflicts with human communities became more likely. Margaret contributed insights from her extensive reading about polar bear research, helping to provide scientific context for the behavioral patterns they had observed during their Arctic visit. March 18th continued with weather conditions that remained favorable for outdoor activities, though Thomas announced that all future excursions would include additional safety measures based on the increasing evidence of polar bear activity in the immediate vicinity of the lodge. The enhanced protocols included mandatory radio communication between guides and the lodge, larger safety margins around wildlife sighting areas, and shortened exposure times for activities that required guests to remain in fixed locations for extended periods. Margaret's scheduled activity for the day was a guided tour of Utqiagvik's community facilities and cultural sites, providing opportunities to learn about contemporary indigenous life while gaining insights into how traditional cultures were adapting to rapidly changing environmental and social conditions. The tour would be conducted by Mary Kanguk, whose knowledge of community history and traditional practices made her an ideal guide for visitors interested in cultural as well as natural aspects of Arctic life. The tour began at 10 a.m. with a visit to the community's cultural center, where displays of traditional clothing, hunting equipment, and household items provided insights into the material culture that had enabled indigenous Arctic peoples to thrive in extreme environments for thousands of years before contact with European civilizations. Mary's explanations of how specific items were constructed and used revealed sophisticated understanding of materials science and engineering principles that had been developed through generations of experimentation and refinement. Margaret's questions about traditional women's roles in Arctic survival demonstrated her understanding that indigenous Arctic cultures had developed highly specialized social systems where different community members contributed essential skills and knowledge for collective survival. Mary appreciated her respectful interest and shared increasingly detailed information about traditional practices, including food preservation techniques, clothing construction methods, and child-rearing practices that had sustained Arctic communities through countless seasonal cycles. The community tour continued with visits to the school, health clinic, and municipal buildings that provided contemporary services while maintaining connections to traditional values and practices. Margaret observed how community members balanced modern necessities with traditional knowledge systems, creating hybrid approaches to Arctic living that drew from both indigenous wisdom and contemporary technology to address the challenges of life in extreme environments. The tour's highlight was a visit to the community's traditional ice cellars, underground storage facilities carved into the permafrost that provided refrigeration for traditional foods without requiring mechanical equipment or electrical power. These cellars represented sophisticated understanding of Arctic geology and climate conditions, utilizing natural permafrost characteristics to create storage systems that had functioned effectively for centuries while requiring minimal maintenance or resource inputs. Margaret's photography during the community tour focused on documenting traditional technologies and contemporary adaptations that demonstrated how indigenous Arctic cultures continued to evolve while maintaining connections to ancestral knowledge systems. Her images captured both the physical artifacts of traditional culture and the faces of community members who were actively engaged in preserving and adapting traditional practices for contemporary circumstances. The afternoon portion of the community tour included a visit to an active whaling camp where community members were preparing equipment for the spring bowhead whale hunting season that would begin in several weeks when ice conditions became suitable for launching traditional skin boats. The whaling preparations provided insights into traditional hunting methods that remain central to community identity and subsistence practices, despite the availability of imported foods from outside sources. Mary Kanguk's explanations of whaling traditions emphasized the spiritual and cultural dimensions of hunting practices that went far beyond simple resource acquisition to encompass complex relationships between human communities and the natural world that sustained them. Margaret's understanding of these perspectives was enhanced by her previous discussions with Professor Blackwood about indigenous worldviews and their differences from Euro-American approaches to human-nature relationships. The community tour concluded with a visit to the cemetery, where community members had been buried according to traditional practices that reflected indigenous beliefs about death, spirituality, and connections between human communities and the Arctic landscape that had shaped their cultures for countless generations. Mary's stories about specific individuals buried in the cemetery provided personal context for the broader cultural and historical information that had been shared throughout the day's activities. Margaret's return to the lodge at 4:30 p.m. provided opportunities to organize her photographs from the community tour while reflecting on the cultural insights she had gained through direct interaction with community members who were actively engaged in preserving traditional knowledge while adapting to contemporary challenges. Her journal entries from the day captured both factual information about traditional practices and personal reflections about the complexity and resilience of indigenous Arctic cultures. The evening meal featured a combination of traditional and contemporary foods that reflected the cultural fusion that characterized modern indigenous Arctic communities, with Elena working alongside community members to create dishes that honored traditional recipes while accommodating the diverse dietary preferences of lodge guests. Margaret's appreciation for the cultural dimensions of the meal added depth to her understanding of how food traditions maintained community identity while adapting to changing circumstances. The final evening of Margaret's Arctic adventure was scheduled to include a farewell presentation by Thomas and his staff, summarizing the natural and cultural highlights of the guests' week-long experience while providing resources for continued learning about Arctic environments and indigenous cultures. The presentation would also address climate change issues and conservation challenges that threatened both Arctic ecosystems and the traditional cultures that depended on them. Margaret's participation in the farewell presentation reflected her genuine engagement with both the natural and cultural aspects of her Arctic experience, her questions and comments demonstrating how much she had learned while revealing her intention to continue studying Arctic issues after returning to her home in Minnesota. Her obvious respect for indigenous knowledge and her thoughtful approach to cross-cultural learning had made her a favorite among lodge staff and community members alike. The presentation included screening of some of the guests' best photographs from their week-long visit, with Margaret's aurora and wildlife images receiving particular recognition for their technical excellence and artistic merit. Her documentation of the community tour and cultural activities also provided valuable visual records that could be used for educational purposes and cultural preservation initiatives that were important to the community. Dr. Amanda Foster's medical expertise had proven valuable throughout the week, not only for her own learning about Arctic adaptations, but also for informal consultations with community members who appreciated access to medical knowledge that was not readily available in such a remote location. Her discussions about wilderness medicine and emergency procedures had enhanced the safety knowledge of both lodge staff and community members who might face medical emergencies when professional help was not immediately accessible. Professor Blackwood's anthropological research had benefited significantly from his interactions with community elders and his observations of contemporary indigenous culture, providing data for his ongoing studies of traditional knowledge systems and cultural adaptation strategies. His academic work would contribute to broader understanding of how indigenous Arctic communities were responding to climate change and social pressures that threatened traditional ways of life, The Yamamoto family's experience had provided valuable cross-cultural perspectives on Arctic environments and indigenous cultures, with their Japanese background offering interesting comparisons to Arctic adaptations and survival strategies. Takeshi's enthusiasm for learning about traditional hunting and survival techniques had made him a favorite among community members who appreciated his respectful curiosity and quick understanding of complex concepts. Robert and Linda Harrison's photography collaboration had produced impressive documentation of Arctic landscapes and wildlife, their professional aviation backgrounds providing unique perspectives on Arctic geography and weather patterns that enhanced their artistic work. Their images would contribute to broader awareness of Arctic beauty and conservation needs among audiences who might never have opportunities for direct Arctic experiences. As the farewell presentation concluded around 10:30 p.m. on March 19th, Margaret felt a complex mixture of satisfaction at having achieved her long-time dream of experiencing the Arctic, while recognizing that the week had raised as many questions as it had answered about polar bear behavior, climate change impacts, and the future of indigenous Arctic cultures. Her journal contained detailed notes and observations that would support continued learning and possible advocacy efforts on behalf of Arctic conservation causes. The lodge's atmosphere during the final evening was characterized by the kind of camaraderie that often developed among travelers who had shared intense experiences in challenging environments, with guests exchanging contact information and making tentative plans for future adventures while expressing gratitude to the staff members whose expertise and hospitality had made their Arctic experience both safe and memorable. Margaret's packing process on the evening of March 19th required careful organization of her photography equipment, extensive notes, and cultural items that she had acquired during her community interactions, all of which needed to be protected against temperature extremes and handling stresses during her return journey to Minnesota. Her systematic approach to packing reflected the same attention to detail that had characterized her preparation for the Arctic adventure and her participation in lodge activities. The departure preparations included final equipment checks, review of travel documents, and coordination of transportation schedules that would return guests to Anchorage for connections to their home destinations. Margaret's departure was scheduled for 2 p.m. on March 20th, providing time for a final morning walk around the lodge perimeter and last-minute photography of the Arctic landscape that had provided the setting for her transformative week-long experience. March 20th began with clear skies and calm conditions that Thomas characterized as perfect for departure, with excellent visibility for the charter flight that would transport guests back to Anchorage and comfortable temperatures that would make their final outdoor activities enjoyable rather than endurance tests. Margaret's final morning at the lodge included a private conversation with Mary Kanguk about traditional knowledge preservation efforts and ways that interested outsiders could support indigenous cultural initiatives. The morning's activities also included final wildlife observation opportunities, with Michael Ockpick leading a short walking tour around the lodge perimeter to look for tracks and other signs of the polar bear activity that had been detected throughout their week-long visit. Fresh tracks discovered approximately 200 yards from the lodge indicated that bears continued to move through the area, though none had approached close enough to pose immediate threats to lodge security. Margaret's final photographs included images of the lodge building itself, documenting the facility that had served as her base for Arctic exploration, while providing safe haven from the extreme conditions and wildlife encounters that characterized life on the edge of the polar wilderness. Her images captured both the functional aspects of Arctic architecture and the human courage required to establish and maintain such facilities in environments where survival was never guaranteed. the charter aircraft arrived at Utqiagvik's airport at 1:45 p.m., slightly ahead of schedule due to favorable weather conditions that had provided smooth flying throughout the route from Anchorage. Margaret's final interactions with lodge staff and community members were marked by genuine warmth and mutual respect that reflected the successful cultural exchange that had enhanced her Arctic experience beyond the natural phenomena she had originally come to witness. Margaret's boarding of the charter flight marked the beginning of her return journey to Minnesota, carrying with her thousands of photographs, extensive notes, and memories that would sustain her appreciation for Arctic environments and indigenous cultures for the remainder of her life. Her window seat provided final views of the Arctic landscape as the aircraft climbed away from Utqiagvik, the vast expanse of snow and ice gradually disappearing beneath clouds as they flew southward toward more temperate regions. The return flight to Anchorage proceeded smoothly with clear weather and excellent visibility that allowed passengers to observe the dramatic transition from Arctic tundra to boreal forest as they traveled southward across Alaska's diverse landscapes. Margaret used the flight time to begin organizing her notes and reviewing her photographs, starting the process of synthesizing her Arctic experience into coherent narratives that she could share with friends and family members who had supported her ambitious adventure. Margaret's arrival in Anchorage at 4:20 p.m. provided several hours for equipment reorganization and final purchases before her overnight flight to Minneapolis, time that she used to visit local outdoor gear stores and bookshops where she could acquire additional resources for continued learning about Arctic environments and indigenous cultures. Her exploration of Anchorage also provided opportunities to meet other Arctic enthusiasts and share stories from her week-long lodge experience. The overnight flight from Anchorage to Minneapolis departed at 11:55 p.m. Alaska time, carrying Margaret back toward her familiar Minnesota surroundings while her mind remained filled with images and experiences from the Arctic adventure that had exceeded her highest expectations. Her journal writing during the flight captured immediate impressions and emotional responses that would fade with time if not recorded, while they remained vivid and accessible. Margaret's arrival in Minneapolis on the morning of March 21st marked the official conclusion of her Arctic adventure. Though the experience would continue to influence her perspectives and interests for years to come through the photographs she had captured, the knowledge she had gained, and the relationships she had formed with people whose lives were intimately connected to Arctic environments and indigenous cultures. The weeks following Margaret's return to Duluth were filled with activities related to processing and sharing her Arctic experience, including digital organization of hundreds of photographs, transcription and expansion of handwritten notes, and preparation of presentations for local photography clubs and environmental organizations that were interested in first-hand accounts of Arctic conditions and climate change impacts. Margaret's presentations about her Arctic experience proved popular among local audiences who had limited knowledge about polar bear behavior, indigenous cultures, and the realities of life in extreme Arctic environments. Her photographs provided compelling visual documentation of Arctic beauty, while her stories about cultural exchanges and wildlife encounters gave personal dimension to abstract concepts about climate change and cultural preservation that often seemed remote from Midwest American experiences. The educational aspects of Margaret's Arctic adventure extended beyond formal presentations to include informal conversations with friends, family members, and community organizations that were interested in learning about environmental issues and indigenous rights topics that had gained new relevance through her direct experiences. Her advocacy efforts on behalf of Arctic conservation causes reflected genuine commitment to supporting the people and environments that had provided such meaningful experiences during her week-long lodge visit. Margaret's continued correspondence with lodge staff and community members maintained connections that had been established during her Arctic visit, providing ongoing opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual learning that enriched her understanding, while offering modest support for economic and cultural development initiatives in Utqiagvik. Her relationships with Thomas, Sarah, Mary Kanguk and other community members evolved into friendships that bridged cultural and geographical distances through shared interests in Arctic environments and conservation issues. The anniversary of Margaret's Arctic adventure on March 17, 2025, was marked by a special presentation at the Duluth Public Library, where she had worked for over 3 decades before retirement, with her photographs and stories providing inspiration for other community members who harbored dreams of adventure travel, despite concerns about age, expense, or physical challenges that seemed to make such experiences impossible. Margaret's Arctic adventure had demonstrated that carefully planned expedition travel could provide transformative experiences for older adults who possessed sufficient determination and resources to pursue their dreams despite obstacles that might discourage less committed individuals. Her successful completion of the challenging journey had required months of preparation, significant financial investment, and physical conditioning efforts that had tested her resolve. But the rewards had justified every sacrifice and preparation effort. The personal transformation that Margaret experienced during her Arctic week extended beyond simple adventure tourism to encompass deeper understanding of environmental issues, cultural preservation challenges, and the interdependence of human communities and natural ecosystems that sustain them. Her Arctic experience had provided perspective on global environmental challenges, while demonstrating the resilience and wisdom of indigenous cultures that had successfully adapted to extreme conditions for thousands of years. Margaret's documentation of her Arctic experience through photography, journal writing, and public presentations contributed to broader awareness of Arctic issues among audiences who might otherwise have remained uninformed about climate change impacts, indigenous rights issues, and conservation challenges that would affect global environmental conditions for generations to come. Her advocacy efforts represented one individual's contribution to collective action on environmental issues that required widespread public understanding and support. The technical aspects of Margaret's Arctic photography had required mastery of specialized equipment and techniques that were essential for capturing high-quality images in extreme cold conditions with limited light availability. Her success in documenting aurora displays, wildlife behavior, and cultural activities had required months of preparation and practice that had tested her technical skills while pushing her artistic abilities to new levels of achievement. Margaret's equipment investments for her Arctic adventure had included specialized cameras, lenses, and accessories designed for extreme cold weather use, along with extensive cold weather clothing and safety equipment that were essential for survival during extended periods of outdoor exposure in sub-zero conditions. Her preparation process had required consultation with equipment manufacturers, experienced Arctic photographers, and outdoor gear specialists who could provide technical advice about product selection and usage techniques. The logistical challenges of Arctic travel had required careful coordination of transportation schedules, accommodation arrangements, and equipment shipping that were complicated by the remote location and extreme weather conditions that could disrupt travel plans without warning. Margaret's successful completion of her Arctic adventure had depended on thorough advance planning combined with flexibility to adapt to changing conditions and unexpected challenges that were inherent in expedition travel. Margaret's physical preparation for Arctic conditions had included conditioning exercises designed to improve her stamina and cold tolerance, along with practice sessions using her photography equipment while wearing bulky gloves and protective clothing that were necessary for Arctic photography, but which complicated camera operation and equipment management. Her preparation efforts had paid dividends during her lodge stay when she was able to work efficiently despite challenging conditions. The educational value of Margaret's Arctic experience had extended beyond personal enrichment to include knowledge acquisition about topics ranging from polar bear biology and behavior to traditional indigenous hunting practices and climate change adaptation strategies that were relevant to broader environmental discussions. Her week-long immersion in Arctic environments and cultures had provided insights that would have been impossible to gain through books, documentaries, or classroom instruction alone. Margaret's interactions with indigenous community members had provided valuable lessons about traditional knowledge systems, cultural preservation efforts, and contemporary challenges facing Arctic communities as climate change and modernization pressured traditional ways of life that had sustained indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Her respectful approach to cross-cultural learning had enabled meaningful exchanges that benefited both her own understanding and the community members who shared their knowledge and perspectives. The economic aspects of Margaret's Arctic adventure had required careful budgeting and financial planning that had influenced her lifestyle choices for several years prior to her trip, with disciplined saving and expense reduction efforts that had made her expensive dream achievable despite her modest retirement income. Her successful completion of the trip had demonstrated that determined individuals could achieve ambitious goals through careful planning and sustained effort over extended periods. Margaret's Arctic photography had produced a collection of images that documented not only natural phenomena and wildlife behavior, but also cultural practices and community life that provided visual records of contemporary indigenous Arctic culture. Her photographs had value for both artistic and documentary purposes, contributing to broader awareness of Arctic beauty while preserving visual records of traditional practices that were changing rapidly due to external pressures. The weather conditions during Margaret's Arctic visit had been relatively favorable compared to the extreme conditions that could occur during March in the Arctic, though temperatures consistently below 0 Fahrenheit and constant wind exposure had still presented significant challenges that had tested her preparation and equipment. Her successful adaptation to Arctic conditions had required both physical and psychological adjustments that had pushed her beyond her previous experience with cold weather conditions. Margaret's week-long Arctic adventure had provided lifetime memories and experiences that had fulfilled dreams she had harbored for decades, while opening new interests and advocacy commitments that would influence her activities for years to come. Her successful completion of such an ambitious journey at age 68 had demonstrated that age need not be a barrier to adventure travel for individuals who possessed adequate preparation, determination, and financial resources. The safety protocols implemented by Thomas and his lodge staff had proven effective throughout Margaret's visit, despite the polar bear activity that had been detected in the immediate vicinity of the lodge, demonstrating that properly managed Arctic tourism could provide exciting wildlife viewing opportunities without compromising guest safety through unnecessary risks or inadequate emergency preparations. The balance between adventure and safety had been carefully maintained throughout her stay. Margaret's relationships with fellow lodge guests had enhanced her Arctic experience through shared activities, diverse perspectives, and collaborative learning opportunities that had enriched her understanding of both natural phenomena and cultural issues that were explored during their week-long stay. The group dynamics had contributed to the overall success of the experience while providing social connections that continued beyond the conclusion of their Arctic adventure. The cultural presentations and community interactions that had been included in Margaret's Lodge program had provided essential context for understanding Arctic environments beyond their natural features, to encompass the human communities that had successfully inhabited such challenging regions for thousands of years. Her exposure to indigenous perspectives had challenged some of her preconceptions while deepening her appreciation for traditional knowledge systems and cultural practices. Margaret's documentation of her Arctic experience through detailed journal writing had captured not only factual information about activities and observations, but also personal reflections and emotional responses that had made the experience transformative rather than simply educational. Her written records had provided resources for later presentations and advocacy efforts, while preserving memories that might otherwise have faded with time. The technical challenges of Arctic photography had required Margaret to master specialized techniques for camera operation in extreme cold, battery management in conditions that quickly drained electrical power, and composition strategies that took advantage of unique Arctic lighting conditions. Her successful documentation of aurora displays and wildlife behavior had required both technical competence and artistic vision that had been developed through extensive preparation and practice. Margaret's Arctic adventure had concluded with her successful return to Minnesota on March 21st, 2024, carrying with her thousands of photographs, extensive notes, and memories that would influence her perspectives and activities for the remainder of her life. The experience had fulfilled her long-time dream of experiencing the Arctic while providing education, inspiration, and advocacy commitments that extended far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass broader environmental and cultural concerns.